In 1971, something happened inside a grey federal building in Ottawa that has never been fully explained. 6,000 documents vanished from Canada's National Archives in a single, coordinated removal operation. No press release, no parliamentary debate, no explanation given to the public, then or now. The people who ordered the removal are mostly dead. The people who carried it out won't talk. And the documents themselves have never resurfaced. Not in another archive, not in a declassified file, not even as a footnote in an academic paper. They are simply gone, as if they never existed. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Let's start with what we actually know, because that part is stranger than most people realize. The year is 1971. Pierre Elliott Trudeau is Prime Minister of Canada, halfway through his first long run in power. The country is in a strange mood, shifting between the optimism of Expo 67 and something darker, something harder to name. The October crisis is barely a year in the past. The government has just finished invoking the War Measures Act for the first time in peacetime, suspending civil liberties across the country, arresting hundreds of Quebecers without charge. The relationship between the Canadian federal government and its own population is complicated in ways that would take decades to untangle, and inside the National Archives of Canada, a team of federal employees begins pulling files. The removal is documented in the sense that records indicate something was taken. Budget allocations show movement of materials. Personnel logs confirm staff were involved. But what those files actually contained, what topics they covered, what names they mentioned, what events they described, none of that appears anywhere in any public record. 6,000 documents, removed in a single operation, filed under a classification system that doesn't match any publicly known archival category of the era. The number itself should give you pause. 6,000 is not a small clerical error. It's not a misfiling or a flood-damaged batch being sent to restoration. 6,000 documents represents a substantial, deliberate collection, a body of material large enough to fill multiple rooms of filing cabinets. Whatever it was important enough to handle carefully and secret enough that nobody involved ever felt comfortable discussing it afterward. So what was in them? That question has quietly haunted Canadian historians, archivists, and independent researchers for more than 50 years. And the deeper you look, the stranger the silence becomes. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what the National Archives of Canada actually was in 1971, and what it was designed to protect. The Public Archives of Canada, as it was officially named at the time, had been formally established in 1872, a handful of years after Confederation. Its purpose was straightforward on paper: to collect, preserve, and make accessible the documentary heritage of the Canadian nation. Government records, private papers, maps, photographs, correspondence from explorers, surveyors, missionaries, traders, and officials. But from its very earliest days, the archives had a secondary function that was never quite publicly articulated. It was also the repository for materials that the government found inconvenient to destroy outright, but didn't want ordinary citizens reading. The archives held things that were, as one internal memorandum from the 1890s phrased it, of sensitive historical character, requiring extended custodial discretion. Extended custodial discretion. That's a remarkably elegant phrase for locking something away and throwing away the key. By 1971, the archives had accumulated more than a century of these sensitive materials, and the internal culture of the institution reflected that history. Archivists who worked there during the 1960s and early 1970s have described, in later interviews and memoirs, a workplace divided into two distinct halves. There was the public-facing operation, helpful and accessible, full of researchers tracing family genealogies and historians writing about the fur trade. And there was the back section, physically separated, where different rules applied and where certain staff worked on materials that were never catalogued in any system accessible to outside researchers. The 1,971 removal came from the back section. We know this because of a single surviving internal memo, discovered by a researcher in 2003 during an unrelated review of administrative correspondence. The memo is brief, unsigned beyond an initial that no one has been able to definitively identify, and it references the removal in terms that assume the reader already knows what is being discussed. It mentions the geographic series, the pre-contact materials, and the Northern correspondence files as distinct categories within the removed batch. And it concludes with a line that has fascinated researchers ever since. Transfer complete as of November. The originals will not be required for public access purposes. Secondary verification of related materials in provincial collections is advised before any future inquiries arise. Secondary verification of related materials in provincial collections. That phrase suggests two things simultaneously. First, that there were related materials elsewhere, in provincial archives across the country, that might corroborate or reference whatever was in the removed documents. Second, that someone was worried about what would happen if a researcher put those pieces together. What were they afraid someone might find? Let's talk about what Canadian history officially says happened on this continent before Europeans arrived. The standard narrative is familiar. Indigenous peoples crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Asia somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 years ago, gradually dispersing southward through North America. They developed distinct cultures and civilizations over thousands of years. Some, like the Mississippian cultures of the American Southeast or the ancestral Puebloans of the Southwest, built impressive architectural complexes. Others lived in ways that left lighter archaeological footprints. The Norse visited briefly around 1000 CE, established a settlement at Lens aux Meadows in Newfoundland, and then left. Then Columbus arrived in 1492. Cabot reached Newfoundland in 1497, and the European colonial period began in earnest. That's the official story, and parts of it are genuinely well supported by archaeological evidence. But there are gaps in that story large enough to swallow entire civilizations. Canada's Northern Territories, the vast arc of land stretching from Labrador across Quebec's interior through northern Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and across the boreal forests and tundra of the Northwest Territories to the Yukon and beyond, represent one of the least archaeologically surveyed regions on Earth. The terrain is brutal and expensive to work in. The growing season is short. Organic materials decay quickly in freeze-thaw cycles, and for most of the 20th century, there was simply not much academic interest in looking too hard at what might be buried up there. But some people did look. And what they found, when they found things, sometimes didn't fit the official story at all. In the summer of 1956, a geological survey team working in the interior of northern Quebec came across something that stopped them cold. They were mapping a region near the upper reaches of a river system that feeds eventually into Hudson Bay, moving through country that had seen very few non-Indigenous visitors in the previous century. The terrain was demanding, the kind of place where you have to earn every mile. What they found was a series of stone structures, not natural formations, not glacial erratics arranged by coincidence, but clearly deliberate constructions. Low walls, partially collapsed, built from flat stones fitted together without mortar, in a technique that the geologists, none of whom were archaeologists, didn't recognize from anything they'd seen in North American prehistory. Nearby, partially buried by moss and soil accumulation, they found what appeared to be worked stone objects, not the kind of chipped flint tools associated with pre-contact indigenous cultures, but ground and polished stone pieces of a different character entirely. The team leader, a man whose name appears in the Geological Survey records as Dr. Kellner, filed a report with the Federal Department of Mines and Technical Surveys, describing what they had found and requesting that archaeological specialists be sent to investigate. The report is on public record. It's brief and careful, written by a man who knows he's outside his expertise and is trying not to overstep. What happened after that report was filed is where things get interesting. An archaeological team was dispatched the following summer. They spent 3 weeks at the site. Their report, however, was classified shortly after submission and has never appeared in any publicly accessible federal archive. The site itself was subsequently flooded by a hydroelectric project in the early 1960s. This is not an isolated incident in Canadian history. It is, in fact, a pattern. Let's slow down on that word, pattern, because that's really what this story is about. Not one mysterious incident, not one missing document, but a recurring shape that appears again and again when you look at a specific kind of Canadian historical record. The pattern has several consistent elements. Someone finds something anomalous, something that doesn't fit the established archaeological narrative of pre-contact North America. They report it through official channels. A federal investigation is initiated. The findings are classified, or the materials are removed. The original site becomes inaccessible through development, flooding, reclassification as restricted land, or some other mechanism that prevents independent verification. The pattern appears in the geological records of the 1930s and 1940s. It appears in the reports filed by Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers stationed in remote northern communities during the 1950s and 1960s, officers who sometimes documented what local Indigenous communities described to them about particular places and particular things in the landscape that the official history didn't account for. It appears in the internal correspondence of the Canadian Museum of Civilization, which went through multiple reorganizations and name changes that coincidentally resulted in the reclassification of large bodies of material each time. And it appears, most dramatically, in the record of what was removed from the National Archives in 1971. The memo we discussed earlier mentioned three categories: the geographic series, the pre-contact materials, and the Northern Correspondence files. Each of those categories has a history that researchers have tried, with varying degrees of success, to trace backward through other records. The geographic series is the most tantalizing and the most difficult to pin down. Canadian federal archivists of the late 19th and early 20th century used the term geographic series to describe collections of documents organized by physical location rather than by department of origin or chronological period. A geographic series for, say, the Peace River District would contain any document touching on that region, regardless of when it was written or which government office produced it. Survey reports, correspondence with trading posts, missionary letters, Indigenous testimony recorded by government agents, mineral assay results, explorer journals that had been acquired by the government, all of it together in one physical collection organized by where things happened rather than when. This organizational system was actually fairly sophisticated and had the advantage of making it easy to compile comprehensive pictures of specific regions. If you wanted to know everything the federal government knew about a particular stretch of northern Ontario, you went to the geographic series for that area, and you could read continuously from the first surveys in the 1870s through the most recent official correspondence, which also meant that if you wanted to understand what the government had known, and perhaps suppressed, about a specific region, the geographic series was exactly where you would look. The 1,971 removal included geographic series files for at least 7 distinct northern regions. We know this because the same 2003 researcher who found the internal memo also found a partial inventory list that appears to correspond to the removed materials. The inventory is incomplete and uses abbreviations and shorthand that aren't always clear, but it allows for rough identification of 7 geographic clusters, all of them in the Canadian North, all of them in regions that were the subject of significant hydroelectric development or mineral extraction activity during the 1960s and 1970s. That overlap between the geographic coverage of the removed documents and the locations of major resource extraction projects is not necessarily meaningful on its own. Canada's north was being developed intensively during that period, and it would make sense that regions with active industrial activity would also have accumulated significant documentary records. But the overlap becomes more interesting when you consider what some of those development projects found and what happened to the records of those findings. Hydroelectric development in northern Canada during the mid-20th century was one of the largest engineering undertakings in human history. The La Grande Complex in northern Quebec, the Churchill Falls project in Labrador, the series of dams along the Nelson River in Manitoba, these were not small operations. They involved flooding areas the size of small countries. They required extensive pre-construction surveying of the affected terrain, and that surveying sometimes turned up things that the construction crews were not equipped to evaluate and were not, it appears, encouraged to publicize. A retired engineer named Paul Tremblay gave an interview in 2009 to a small Quebec Historical Society newsletter. He had worked on the preliminary surveying for one of the major La Grande projects in the late 1960s. He described, in careful and understated language, coming across what he called anomalous structures in a valley that would subsequently be flooded. He reported the discovery to his supervisors. He was told that federal heritage officials had been notified and would handle the assessment. He was instructed not to discuss the findings with other members of the survey team or include them in his working reports. He never heard anything further about it. The valley was flooded on schedule. Tremblay was in his 70s when he gave that interview and said he had waited decades before talking about it because he hadn't wanted to cause professional problems for himself during his working years. He said he had always assumed that whatever was there had been properly assessed and documented before the flooding, that it was stored somewhere in some federal collection that he just didn't have access to. He hadn't heard about the 1,971 removal when he gave the interview. When the interviewer told him about it, there was, by the written account, a long pause before he spoke again. Let's talk about the Northern Correspondence Files, because this category opens a different door entirely. Throughout the late 19th and most of the 20th century, the Canadian federal government maintained a network of correspondence with its representatives in the far north. These were not only government officials in the usual sense. They included RCMP officers stationed in remote detachments, Indian agents assigned to manage relations with indigenous communities, Hudson's Bay Company representatives, who sometimes functioned as quasi-governmental authorities in areas without formal government presence, and missionaries of various denominations who operated schools and missions in remote communities and who sometimes served as informal conduits of information to federal authorities. All of these people wrote letters. They wrote reports. They documented what they saw and heard and were told, and much of that documentation flowed back to Ottawa, where it was collected and organized and filed. The Northern Correspondence Files, in the National Archives, represented this accumulated documentary record. They covered a period from roughly 1870 to the late 1960s, nearly a century of continuous observation and reporting from people living in intimate contact with the land and with the indigenous communities that had inhabited it for thousands of years. Those communities had oral traditions, deep, detailed, carefully maintained oral traditions about the land, about its history, about things they had found in it, and about things that had happened on it long before the arrival of Europeans. Some of the federal correspondents who worked in northern communities recorded what they were told. They wrote it down in their letters and reports, sometimes because they thought it was practically useful, sometimes because they found it genuinely fascinating, and sometimes, frankly, because they had been out in the bush for a long time and needed to write about something interesting. What those letters contained, what Indigenous elders had told RCMP officers and Indian agents and missionaries about the pre-contact history of specific northern locations, we can only partially reconstruct from what was not removed, because not everything was removed. The 1,971 operation was focused and specific. It took particular files and left others. Which means that by looking at what remains, and at the gaps in what remains, you can sometimes infer what was taken. A researcher named Margaret Forsyth spent nearly a decade doing exactly that kind of inferential archival work. She was a graduate student in Canadian history in the 1980s and early 1990s, and her doctoral dissertation, which was completed but never formally published in a major academic press, attempted to map the contours of the 1,971 removal by examining the surrounding documentary record. Her methodology was patient and meticulous. She identified files that referenced other files that no longer existed. She found letters that mentioned enclosures that were missing. She located index cards in old catalogue systems that pointed to materials that couldn't be located in any current collection. She interviewed retired archivists, some of whom confirmed that materials had been removed and none of whom would say what those materials contained. The picture that emerged from her work was partial and inferential, but it was suggestive. Forsyth concluded that a significant portion of the removed materials dealt with three overlapping subjects. First, there were reports of archaeological or semi-archaeological finds in the Canadian North, ranging from stone structures to unusual artifacts to human remains that didn't match expected population characteristics. Second, there was correspondence related to Indigenous oral traditions, specifically describing pre-contact contacts with non-Indigenous peoples in northern regions. And third, there were survey and geological reports from specific regions that appeared to describe features of the landscape that had been subsequently developed away or flooded. She was careful in her dissertation not to make strong claims about what this might mean. She wrote in the restrained language of academic historical methodology, using phrases like, "the evidence is consistent with," and "this interpretation cannot be ruled out," but the underlying argument was clear enough. End quote. Someone, in 1971, had decided that a specific body of evidence about Canada's pre-contact history needed to be removed from public access, and the shape of that removed evidence suggested it concerned things that the official narrative of North American prehistory did not account for. Forsyth's dissertation circulated in photocopied form among a small community of Canadian historical researchers during the 1990s. It is referenced in footnotes in several academic papers. The original is held in the university library, where she completed her degree. Her name appears in some online discussions of Canadian historical anomalies, but the broader academic establishment largely declined to engage with her work, and she eventually moved into archival administration rather than continuing as a researcher. Whether that was a choice she made freely or one that was shaped by the reception of her conclusions is impossible to say from the outside. Let's step back and think about what kind of history might be at stake here. The pre-contact history of North America is officially one of the most well-understood aspects of human prehistory. The basic Bering-Land Bridge model, the gradual southward dispersal of populations, the development of distinct regional cultures over thousands of years, these elements are supported by substantial archaeological and genetic evidence. This is real science, carefully done, and it tells a genuine story about how people came to inhabit a continent. But there are anomalies. There have always been anomalies, and the official response to those anomalies has followed a consistent pattern of its own. Dismiss them, reclassify the evidence, and wait for the conversation to move on. In Canada specifically, there are documented cases of archaeological finds that generated significant initial interest and then quietly disappeared from the professional literature. There are sites that were investigated, reported on, and then somehow never followed up. There are artifacts in museum collections that are catalogued in ways that obscure their origin or their significance. And there is a documented, undeniable removal of 6,000 documents in 1971 that has never been explained. When you start pulling on these threads, a particular kind of picture begins to emerge. It is a picture of a country that has been more aggressively managed, historically speaking, than most Canadians realize. Not in a grand conspiracy theory sense, not as a unified secret plot orchestrated by shadowy figures, but in the more mundane and therefore more disturbing sense of a bureaucratic culture that, over generations, developed habits of suppression around certain categories of historical evidence, not because there was a master plan, but because the people involved understood, without necessarily discussing it explicitly, that certain things were better left unfound. Better left unfound for whom? That's the question that starts to open up dimensions of this story that most official historical narratives actively avoid. Here is something that Canadian history textbooks rarely emphasize, though the underlying facts are not disputed. When European colonial powers arrived in North America, they were not confronting a pristine wilderness inhabited by peoples without history. They were confronting populated, complex, historically rich societies with their own deep pasts, their own internal politics, their own traditions of knowledge about the land they had inhabited for thousands of years. And from the very beginning of the colonial project, one of its central mechanisms was the systematic erasure of that pre-existing history. This erasure operated at multiple levels simultaneously. It operated physically, through the destruction of settlements, the burning of records, the suppression of languages that carried historical knowledge. It operated legally, through treaty structures that redefined land tenure in ways that erased prior occupation. It operated intellectually, through the construction of academic disciplines like archaeology and anthropology that positioned European researchers as the authoritative interpreters of Indigenous history, often in explicit opposition to what Indigenous communities themselves said about their own pasts. And it operated archivally. The things that were written down about pre-contact North America by early colonial observers many of which described things that didn't fit the emerging academic consensus, were quietly marginalized, reclassified, lost, or removed. The 1,971 removal needs to be understood in this context. It was not an isolated event. It was one dramatic episode in a much longer process of selective historical management, and it happened at a moment when that longer process was beginning to face challenges it had not previously encountered. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a period of extraordinary pressure on the Canadian colonial historical apparatus. Indigenous rights movements were gaining momentum and public visibility. Legal challenges to treaty interpretations were working their way through the courts. Academic critics within archaeology and anthropology were beginning to question the field's relationship with the communities it studied. The residential school system, which had operated for decades as a mechanism for severing Indigenous children from their cultural and historical knowledge, was facing increasing scrutiny. At exactly this moment, when the historical record of pre-contact North America was becoming politically and legally consequential in new ways, 6,000 documents disappeared from the National Archives. That timing is not proof of anything, but it is suggestive. If those documents contained evidence of pre-contact histories that contradicted or complicated the official narrative, their removal in 1971 would have served to protect that narrative at precisely the moment it was most under pressure. It would have ensured that legal challenges built on historical documentation couldn't access certain categories of evidence. It would have maintained a field of historical interpretation in which Indigenous oral traditions could be dismissed as legend, without the embarrassment of corroborating documentary evidence from official federal sources sitting in accessible archives. This is speculative, but it is a speculation grounded in documented patterns of behavior, and it is the kind of speculation that serious historians, when they are willing to discuss the 1,971 removal at all, find difficult to dismiss entirely. Let's talk about some of the specific anomalies that appear in the historical record of the Canadian North. Anomalies that might, if the documents had not been removed, have found corroboration in the National Archives. The first category involves what might be called contact anomalies, evidence or accounts of non-Indigenous, non-Norse contact with northern North America in the pre-Columbian period. This is one of the most contested and politically charged areas in North American historical scholarship. The official position is clear. The only confirmed European contact before Columbus was the Norse settlement at Lanceau Meadows around 1000 CE, which lasted briefly and left no lasting impact. Everything else is speculation or fraud, but the evidence for other contacts is more substantial than its academic treatment suggests. In the 1960s, a series of carved stone artifacts were found in northern Quebec. They were found by people with no archaeological training, which immediately made them suspect in academic eyes. But the objects themselves were examined by several specialists who concluded, carefully and with appropriate hedging, that they exhibited characteristics not consistent with known Indigenous stoneworking traditions of the region. The examination reports were submitted to the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs, which forwarded them to the National Archives for classification. They have not been publicly accessible since. In the late 1950s, a missionary working among Inuit communities in the Eastern Arctic documented oral accounts from elderly community members describing encounters in the memory of their grandparents or great-grandparents with people who arrived from the East in unusual boats, who were of different physical appearance from the Inuit themselves, and who had different tools and materials. These accounts didn't necessarily describe Vikings in any detail that would have suggested Norse origin. They described something else, something that the missionary, writing in the late 1950s, found sufficiently interesting to report in detail to the church authorities, who forwarded a copy to federal Indian Affairs officials. Those reports entered the federal correspondence system. They would have been candidates for the Northern Correspondence Files. In the 1940s, a series of geological survey reports from islands in Hudson Bay described finding carved stone objects that the surveyors couldn't account for within their knowledge of the region's history. These were professional government employees making professional observations. Their reports were filed and processed through normal channels. They are in the public geological survey record up to a certain point, and then the thread goes cold. The follow-up assessments that should exist in the record are absent. None of these individual cases is conclusive. Each of them can be explained, or explained away, through alternative means. But the pattern of their disappearance from accessible records, and the timing of that disappearance, is harder to dismiss. The second category involves what might be called the structural anomalies, places in the Canadian landscape where features exist that don't fit easily into what the official, pre-contact historical narrative predicts should be there. The Peterborough petroglyphs, officially known as Kinamajuapkong, are a documented example of this category. They are a remarkable collection of carved images on a large marble outcropping in Ontario, some 1,500 individual carvings made over an extended period of time. The site is real, it's protected, it's studied, and yet professional interpretation of it has been consistently controversial. Some of the imagery has been claimed to show resemblances to script systems from the ancient Mediterranean world, claims that mainstream archaeologists dismiss emphatically. What's interesting is not necessarily whether those claims are correct, but rather the vehemence with which any non-standard interpretation is rejected, and the documented removal of certain comparative materials from the available literature. In northern Ontario and Quebec, there are numerous sites with stone wall features, low walls of fitted stone that appear to be deliberate constructions rather than natural formations. Most of these have never been formally assessed. Those that have been assessed have generally received one of two treatments. They are either attributed to recent Indigenous construction, for which the cultural context no longer survives, or they are attributed to natural geological processes, a conclusion that visiting geologists have sometimes privately disputed. In the Canadian Shield, across the vast Precambrian rock that underlies much of central Canada, there are locations described in early explorers' journals that suggest structures or features that those journals' authors found anomalous. Some of those journal entries were subsequently published in edited forms that omitted the anomalous passages. Some of the original manuscripts are in the National Archives. Whether any of them were among the 1,971 removal is unknown. The third category is the most sensitive and the most directly relevant to Indigenous rights politics, which likely explains both why those materials existed and why they might have been removed. Throughout the period covered by the Northern Correspondence Files, federal representatives in northern communities had access to Indigenous oral historical traditions that described the deep past of the land in ways that didn't align with either the official archaeological narrative or with colonial, legal frameworks about land use and occupancy. Indigenous oral traditions about the northern landscape are not vague or poetic. They are specific. They describe particular places, particular events, particular encounters. They describe what was found in the land, what was built on it, what happened to those who built there. They describe relationships between different peoples who inhabited the same landscape at different times, or occasionally at the same time. When federal agents, missionaries, and police officers encountered these traditions in the mid-20th century, they responded in different ways. Some dismissed them as legend. Some recorded them carefully, treating them as potentially significant information about the regions they were tasked with administering. Some found them disturbing in ways they couldn't quite articulate. The materials that were recorded and entered the federal correspondence system represent an extraordinary archive of Indigenous historical knowledge as transmitted through official colonial channels. That archive, filtered and imperfect as it necessarily was, contained information about the pre-contact past of the Canadian North that no other documentary source preserved. If those materials supported Indigenous claims about historical land use, about the depth and continuity of Indigenous presence in specific northern regions, about the existence of prior occupation by other peoples that complicated the colonial legal framework, their removal would have served clear political purposes. In 1971, land claims litigation in Canada was beginning to develop in ways that would eventually reshape the entire relationship between Indigenous peoples and the federal government. The Calder case, which would reach the Supreme Court in 1973, was working its way through the British Columbia courts during exactly this period. The legal arguments being developed in Calder, and in the cases that followed it, depended on evidence of historical land use and occupancy. 6,000 documents removed from the National Archives in November 1971, 2 years before the landmark Calder decision. Let's take a different angle on this story and talk about what Canadian archaeologists were actually finding in the field during the years leading up to 1971. The 1960s were a period of significant archaeological activity in Canada. Federal funding for archaeological survey work increased substantially during the decade, partly in connection with the infrastructure projects that were transforming the northern landscape, and partly because of the general expansion of academic institutions during the post-war period. More archaeologists were working in more parts of the country than ever before, and they were finding things. Not the kind of dramatic things that make international headlines, but the kind of steady accumulation of evidence that, over time, builds or undermines theoretical frameworks. Small anomalies, individually dismissible, collectively significant. An archaeologist named James Worthington, who published his memoirs privately in the 1990s, described working in northern Saskatchewan in the early 1960s on a federal survey. His team was assessing a region scheduled for flooding associated with a dam project, standard pre-construction archaeological survey work of the kind that was increasingly required by federal regulations during that period. Worthington wrote that his team found, in a stratum of soil that, based on the surrounding geological context, should have predated any human presence in the region by thousands of years, a series of worked stone objects that he could not explain. Not flaked tools in the style of known indigenous traditions, but ground and polished pieces. Some appeared to be fragments of larger objects. Some had what appeared to be deliberately incised marks on their surfaces. He described filing his report through the standard channels and receiving, within a few weeks, a communication from a federal official he had never dealt with before, who informed him that the materials his team had found would be transferred to a different federal collection for specialist assessment, and that his team should not include descriptions of those specific finds in their published survey report, because the specialist assessment was still ongoing. Worthington said he waited for years for any communication about the outcome of that specialist assessment. It never came. When he tried to follow up through his institutional contacts, he was told the materials had been assessed and classified. He was given no further information. He noted in his memoir that he had subsequently learned from a colleague who worked in the National Archives in the early 1970s that a significant removal operation had taken place in 1971. His memoir was careful not to claim any direct connection, but the implication was clear. What was the mechanism of the 1971 removal? How was it organized and carried out? The documentary evidence on this question is frustratingly thin, for obvious reasons. But some elements can be reconstructed. The removal appears to have been authorized at a fairly senior level of the federal government, above the level of the National Archives Administration itself. This can be inferred from the fact that the archive staff, who were involved in the physical operation, were clearly acting under instructions from outside their normal chain of command. Several retired archivists, when asked about the operation in interviews given over the years since, have described being told to assist with a reclassification and transfer operation without being given details about why it was being done or where the materials were going. Where the materials were going is one of the central unresolved questions. Some researchers believe the removed documents were destroyed. This would be the simplest explanation for why they have never surfaced in any other collection. The federal government has the legal authority to destroy records under certain circumstances, and the procedures for doing so, while they involve some documentation, could potentially be managed in ways that obscure what specifically was being destroyed. Other researchers believe the documents were transferred to a restricted collection that continues to exist in some form. The logic here is that governments generally prefer to restrict access to information rather than destroy it, because destroyed information can't be used when circumstances change and the government decides it wants to use it. If the removed documents contained information about specific northern regions, that information might be practically useful to future governments, even if it wasn't something they wanted publicly available. A third possibility, one that some researchers find most plausible, is that the documents were transferred not to another federal collection, but to a different kind of institution entirely. There is some evidence, difficult to verify, that certain sensitive historical materials from various federal sources and were consolidated during the early 1970s into a collection maintained by an agency that was not primarily an archival institution. Which agency and what became of that collection are questions that no one who knows the answer has been willing to address on the record. Let's shift our focus to the indigenous dimension of this story more explicitly, because in many ways it is the most important dimension. When we talk about missing documents and suppressed pre-contact history, it is easy to fall into a framing that treats this as primarily a mystery about the distant past, a puzzle for scholars to solve. But the history that was suppressed is not abstract. It is the history of peoples who are alive today, who maintain relationships with the land that was the subject of those removed documents, who carry in their oral traditions knowledge that the federal government apparently found threatening enough to remove from its own archives. Indigenous communities across the Canadian North have oral traditions that describe a complex and deep pre-contact history. They describe encounters with other peoples. They describe structures and places that no longer exist, or that exist in forms not recognized by official archaeology. They describe a relationship with the land, extending back thousands of years, a relationship that includes knowledge about specific locations, specific events, specific things that were there and are no longer there. For decades, these oral traditions were systematically dismissed by the dominant academic and legal cultures as legend, as mythology, as unreliable evidence of historical reality. Indigenous peoples were told, explicitly and repeatedly, that their own knowledge of their own history was not credible without corroboration from documentary sources that the colonial apparatus controlled. And then, in 1971, 6,000 documents from the Federal Archive that might have provided exactly that kind of corroboration were removed. The cruelty of that specific timing is not something that can be overlooked. There are Indigenous scholars and community members who have been tracking this story for decades. They approach it differently from most academic researchers, not because they are less rigorous, but because they already know, through their own traditions, much of what was in those files. They know it because it's their history. The files were federal records of conversations that Indigenous people had with federal officials, transcriptions of oral traditions that Indigenous communities maintained. The removal of those files didn't erase the knowledge. It just prevented the federal government from being confronted with its own documentation of that knowledge. This framing of the 1,971 removal as an act that served the specific purpose of preventing documentary corroboration of Indigenous historical claims at a critical moment in Indigenous rights litigation is not one that appears in any official account. But among researchers who specialize in the intersection of Canadian legal history and pre-contact archaeology, it is not a fringe view. In 2008, a Freedom of Information request was filed by a small research organization based in Ottawa, specifically requesting documentation related to the 1,971 archival removal operation. The request was carefully worded, citing the specific elements of the documentary record that were already publicly known, including the internal memo discovered in 2003 and the partial inventory list. The response came 14 months later. The federal government acknowledged that administrative reclassification activities had taken place in the National Archives during the early 1970s. It provided several pages of documentation about the President's archival reclassification procedures that were standard practice during that period, none of which specifically addressed the 1,971 operation. It stated that certain materials from that period were subject to ongoing access review under provisions of the Access to Information Act that allow for extended restriction of materials that could affect national security or the conduct of federal-provincial negotiations. Federal-provincial negotiations. That phrase, buried in a bureaucratic response to a Freedom of Information request, is one of the most revealing things in the entire paper trail, because the one area of active federal-provincial negotiation in Canada that involves historical documentation about specific northern regions is Indigenous land claims. The resolution of outstanding land claims requires examination of historical evidence about who occupied which land and when. If the removed documents contained relevant historical evidence, their classification as materials affecting federal-provincial negotiations would be legally sustainable and would allow the government to maintain their restriction indefinitely. Let's talk about some of the researchers who have tried to push this story further and what happened to them. Academic history in Canada is not a field that rewards nonconformity. The major institutions, the universities, the museums, the government research agencies, all exist within an ecosystem of funding, reputation, and professional recognition that depends on conformity to established frameworks. A junior academic who raises serious questions about suppressed pre-contact history faces career consequences that an established senior professor doesn't. This dynamic has operated throughout the period since the 1971 removal, effectively limiting the space available for serious professional engagement with the questions the removal raises. But some people have pushed anyway. We've already discussed Margaret Forsyth and her doctoral dissertation. Her case illustrates the career consequences clearly. A decade of careful, rigorous research, an unpublished dissertation that remains an important reference for anyone working in this area, and a subsequent shift away from research into administration. She has given occasional interviews over the years and has been consistently supportive of other researchers working in this space, but she has not published further research of her own. A geologist named Robert Keane, who worked for a mining company in northern Ontario in the 1970s and 1980s, spent his retirement years compiling a private archive of anomalous discoveries from his decades in the field and from his extensive correspondence with other geologists who had worked in the same regions. He self-published 2 books, in 2001 and 2006, that documented dozens of individual cases of unusual finds and their subsequent administrative histories. His books are available in some university library systems. They are not reviewed in any professional journals. They are, however, extensively footnoted and cross-referenced, the work of a meticulous professional intelligence applied to questions that mainstream professional culture wouldn't touch. A Quebec journalist named André Beauchemin spent several years in the early 2000s investigating the 1971 removal for a long-form piece in a Montreal magazine. He got closer than most people had. He identified several individuals who had worked in the National Archives during the relevant period and who were willing to speak with him carefully and anonymously about what they knew. He developed a picture of the removal operation that was more detailed than anything previously available. His piece was accepted for publication, went through fact-checking, and was then pulled before it ran. The magazine's editorial leadership cited concerns about legal exposure. Beauchemin has maintained, in conversations documented online, that the concerns were not primarily legal. He has not published the piece elsewhere. He moved away from journalism within a few years of that episode. The silence around this story is not uniform. It has texture, it has shape, and its shape tells you something. The silence is loudest in institutional academic history, in the mainstream Canadian history journals, in the textbooks, in the publicly funded museum exhibitions about pre-contact North America. In those spaces, the 1971 removal essentially does not exist as a topic. You can spend an entire career as a professional Canadian historian without ever being required to engage with it. The silence is somewhat thinner in legal contexts, particularly in the context of land claims litigation. Lawyers working on Indigenous land claims have, in some cases, been aware of the 1971 removal and its implications, and have made arguments in various proceedings that hinge on the inaccessibility of the removed materials. These arguments have generally not been successful, precisely because the materials are inaccessible, but the attempt to make them is documented in legal records. The silence is thinnest of all in Indigenous communities in the Canadian North, where the knowledge that the federal government removed historical documentation that described their land and their ancestors is not a secret or a conspiracy theory. It's an experience, specific and remembered, of being erased. There is one more element of this story that hasn't been discussed yet, an element that tends to generate the most skepticism from anyone with a conventional historical background, but that is too well documented to ignore. Among the geographic series files that were removed in 1971, the partial inventory list that was recovered in 2003 includes entries that appear to describe collections associated with specific rivers, lakes, and land formations in the Canadian North. Most of these are identifiable as regions with known archaeological potential or known Indigenous historical significance. But several of the entries using shorthand that the 2003 researcher couldn't fully decode, appear to reference locations that have an additional layer of significance. They appear to reference the same locations that appear in a different category of historical document entirely. The survey records filed by Jesuit missionaries working in northern Quebec and Ontario during the 17th and 18th centuries. The Jesuits were extraordinary documentarians. They wrote detailed reports, the famous Jesuit Relations, about everything they encountered in their missions. And they moved through the Canadian North during a period when they were still encountering elements of pre-contact Indigenous culture in relatively less disrupted forms. They recorded what they were told and what they saw with considerable care. Some of those Jesuit reports describe locations in the northern landscape where unusual things were found, or where unusual knowledge was associated with a specific place. Locations where Indigenous guides refused to go. Locations where strange structures existed that the Indigenous communities themselves described as not made by any people they knew of. Locations associated with what the missionaries described as traditions of earlier peoples, whose relationship to the current inhabitants was unclear. These specific locations appear in the Jesuit Relations. They appear, apparently, in the Geographic Series files that were removed in 1971. And, in at least 2 cases that researchers have been able to document, they also appear in the preliminary survey reports filed by the hydroelectric projects of the 1960s, the surveys that found anomalous things and whose findings were subsequently classified. The convergence of 3 independent documentary traditions, 17th century Jesuit reports, 20th century federal geographic files, and 20th century industrial survey reports, all pointing to the same specific northern locations, is not easily explained by coincidence. Let's think through the various explanations for the 1,971 removal and assess them against the evidence. The most innocuous explanation is administrative. The documents were removed as part of a routine reclassification process. Similar operations happened in archives around the world during this period, and there is nothing more significant to the story than bureaucratic housekeeping applied to old and poorly catalogued materials. This explanation has several problems. The scale of the removal is too large for routine housekeeping. The authorization level was too high. The subsequent unwillingness of anyone involved to discuss it doesn't match the behavior of people carrying out ordinary administrative tasks. And the specific categories described in the partial inventory, the geographic series, the pre-contact materials, the northern correspondence files, these are not the categories of materials that would normally be prioritized in a routine administrative reclassification. The second explanation is security-related. The documents contained sensitive information about specific northern locations, related perhaps to mineral resources or strategic geography, and were removed for national security reasons consistent with the Cold War context of 1971. This explanation is more plausible on its face. Canada's north has always had strategic significance, and the government's management of information about specific northern regions has sometimes been coloured by national security concerns. But the partial inventory's reference to pre-contact materials doesn't sit easily with this explanation. Pre-contact archaeological information about northern rivers and lakes wouldn't normally be classified for national security purposes. The third explanation is the one that this story has been building toward. The documents were removed because of their content, specifically because they contained information about pre-contact North American history that the federal government didn't want accessible, particularly at a moment when that history was becoming legally and politically consequential for Indigenous land rights. This explanation accounts for more of the evidence than the alternatives. It explains the timing. It explains the specific categories of materials removed. It explains the convergence of these materials with the locations of major resource extraction projects. It explains the subsequent management of freedom of information requests. And it is consistent with documented patterns of federal behavior toward Indigenous historical knowledge throughout the colonial period. What would we actually find if the removed documents were suddenly and miraculously made accessible tomorrow? This is the question that researchers who have thought most carefully about this story tend to approach with the most caution, because the answer is genuinely unknown and the range of possibilities is wide. At one end of the spectrum, we might find documentation of pre-contact contacts between northern North American indigenous peoples and peoples from elsewhere, whether from across the Atlantic, across the Pacific, or from regions of North America, that the official narrative of pre-contact migration patterns doesn't account for well. This would be historically significant, but not world-shatteringly so. Archaeologists already know, and the public is gradually coming to understand, that pre-contact North America was more connected and more complex than the old textbook narratives suggested. At the middle of the spectrum, we might find comprehensive documentation of indigenous oral historical traditions about specific northern locations, documenting with federal official authority the specific claims about land use, land history, and pre-contact activity that indigenous communities have maintained in their own traditions. This would be legally and politically significant in ways that would directly affect ongoing land claims negotiations. It would corroborate indigenous testimonial evidence with documentary evidence from the colonial administration's own archives. At the further end of the spectrum, we might find evidence of things that would require more fundamental revision of our understanding of North American prehistory. Evidence, in the form of official government documentation of physical sites and artifacts, that pushes back the timeline of complex organized activity in the Canadian North further than current models account for. Not necessarily evidence of lost civilizations in the dramatic sense, but evidence that the story we've been telling ourselves about this continent is missing significant chapters. And at the furthest end, the possibility that researchers rarely articulate, but that the convergence of evidence sometimes forces you to consider. We might find documentation of something that doesn't fit any of our current explanatory frameworks at all, something that the government officials who commissioned the removal couldn't fully explain themselves, but that they knew, from whatever they had in those files, required management. There is a broader context to this story that Canadian history largely refuses to confront directly, but that becomes unavoidable once you spend enough time with the specific details of what we know and don't know about the pre-contact past of this continent. North America, before the arrival of Europeans, was home to civilizations of extraordinary sophistication and scale. The academic literature acknowledges this now more fully than it did 50 years ago. The Mississippian cultures of the American Southeast built cities larger than most contemporary European cities. The ancestral Puebloans of the Southwest developed architectural and astronomical knowledge that continues to generate scholarly awe. The mound-building cultures that stretched across eastern North America constructed earthworks on a scale that remains impressive. These civilizations existed, flourished, and in many cases collapsed long before European contact. The causes of their collapse are debated. The connections between them are imperfectly understood. And their northern extensions, the ways in which the complex cultures of the pre-contact South and Midwest connected to the peoples of the Canadian North, is one of the least studied and most poorly understood aspects of North American prehistory. The Canadian North was not a blank space in pre-contact North America. It was part of a connected world of relationships, movements, and exchanges that extended across the entire continent. The oral traditions of northern indigenous peoples reflect this. They remember connections to the south, to the east, to peoples and places that no longer exist in the forms they once had. They remember things that happened in specific northern locations that have left no trace in the official archaeological record. Some of those memories, captured by federal correspondents in the 19th and 20th centuries, went into the files that were removed in 1971. Let me take you back to that internal memo one more time. The one found in 2003 by the researcher doing an unrelated archival review. Transfer complete as of November. The originals will not be required for public access purposes. Secondary verification of related materials in provincial collections is advised before any future inquiries arise. That final line. Secondary verification of related materials in provincial collections is advised before any future inquiries arise. This sentence has been parsed and analysed by everyone who has encountered it. The operative phrase is, before any future inquiries arise. That's not the language of administrative process. Administrative process doesn't worry about future inquiries. It follows procedures and documents what it does. Before any future inquiries arise is the language of someone who knows that the materials being removed and potentially related materials that are not being removed could become the subject of serious scrutiny. It's the language of someone managing a situation, taking an action in November of 1971, with awareness that at some future point, someone might come looking. Who was going to come looking? For what? The most plausible answer, given everything else we know about the context, is that the anticipated inquiries were legal ones. Land claims litigation, the Calder case that would reach the Supreme Court in 1973. The expanding universe of indigenous rights, legal challenges that were just beginning to take shape in the early 1970s. The federal government, or people within the federal government, understood that historical documentation of indigenous land use and pre-contact indigenous history was going to become legally consequential, and they took action to ensure that the documentation held in the National Archives would not be available to support those claims. If that reading is correct, the 1971 removal was not primarily about hiding history, it was primarily about legal strategy. About preventing a category of historical evidence from being available in the proceedings that were going to define the legal status of vast tracts of Canadian land for decades to come. The hydroelectric projects that flooded the northern landscapes and the archival removal that preceded them are connected in more ways than just geographic coincidence. The La Grande complex in northern Quebec flooded approximately 11,500 square kilometers of land. The Churchill Falls project in Labrador flooded more than 6,000 square kilometers. The Nelson River projects in Manitoba, the dams in northern Ontario, the various water management projects across the Canadian North. Collectively, these projects transform the physical landscape of the Canadian North on a scale that is difficult to comprehend without seeing the before and after maps. They also destroyed, permanently and irrecoverably, any physical evidence of pre-contact activity that existed in those flooded landscapes. Whatever stone structures existed in those valleys, whatever artifacts lay in the soil, whatever landscape features had been shaped by centuries of human use, all of it is now underwater, under hundreds of feet of reservoir, gone, and the documentary record of what was found during the pre-construction surveys of those landscapes, the records that described what was there before the flooding, was removed from the National Archives in 1971. The physical evidence was destroyed by the flooding. The documentary evidence was removed by the archival operation. And the oral traditional knowledge that preserved memory of those places exists in indigenous communities that were themselves displaced by the same hydroelectric projects, removed from their traditional territories and resettled in communities that separated them from the specific landscape knowledge they carried. This triple erasure, physical, documentary and testimonial, achieved through three apparently separate mechanisms, the industrial projects, the archival removal, and the community resettlements, resulted in the effective disappearance of a significant body of knowledge about pre-contact history in the Canadian North. Whether those mechanisms were coordinated is unknown, but the result of their interaction is documented, and it is devastating. Let's talk about what happened after 1971, because the story doesn't end with the removal. In the years and decades following 1971, there were occasional flickers of renewed attention to these questions. Individual researchers, working independently, would encounter evidence of the removal and try to follow the threads. Most of those attempts hit walls. A few made progress, documented what they found, and then stopped publishing or moved on to other subjects. The access to information regime that developed in Canada through the 1980s and 1990s created new formal mechanisms for requesting historical government records. Researchers used these mechanisms repeatedly to request information about the 1971 removal. The responses, as we've seen, were consistently managed in ways that acknowledged the existence of the operation without providing meaningful information about its substance. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which operated from 2008 to 2015 and produced a landmark report on the residential school system, created an environment in which some aspects of the federal government's historical management of Indigenous history became more publicly discussable. But the Commission's mandate was focused on the residential school system specifically, and the broader question of archival suppression of pre-contact historical evidence was outside its scope. Some of the academic historians who came of age after the TRC report have approached questions about Canadian colonial history with more critical awareness than their predecessors. But the specific question of the 1,971 archival removal remains largely outside mainstream academic engagement, partly because the primary evidence is inaccessible, and partly because engaging seriously with the question requires confronting implications that the mainstream historical profession finds uncomfortable. There is a moment in the recent history of this story that deserves particular attention. In 2018, a graduate student in Indigenous history at a Canadian university filed a Freedom of Information request for all materials related to the 1,971 archival removal that were held in federal records, phrasing the request differently from previous attempts and specifically invoking provisions of the Access to Information Act related to historical records with Indigenous rights implications. The response, which came almost 2 years later, included something that previous responses had not included: a reference to the existence of a restricted collection of materials that had been transferred in the early 1970s from the National Archives to the custody of a different federal institution. The response did not name that institution. It indicated that the materials remained subject to access restriction and referred the requester to a specific provision of the Act that allows for permanent restriction of materials that could affect the resolution of outstanding Indigenous rights claims. The specific provision cited is one that was amended in 2006 to provide for this kind of permanent restriction. Before 2006, the provision required periodic review. After 2006, materials could be restricted indefinitely. The 2018 Freedom of Information response was the first official confirmation that the removed materials had been transferred rather than destroyed. It was also, inadvertently, an admission that those materials contained content with direct relevance to Indigenous rights claims, because only materials in that category can be restricted under the provision the government cited. The graduate student who filed the request has been pursuing follow-up requests since then. Progress has been slow. Let's consider what the existence of this story tells us about the nature of official history. We learn history through the documents that survive. This is a basic, methodological reality of historical scholarship. We can only know what was recorded, and we can only access what has been preserved and made accessible. When significant bodies of documentation are removed from accessibility, the history that is subsequently written will reflect their absence. It will be shaped by what is not there as much as by what is. The 1,971 removal created a gap in the documentary record of Canadian pre-contact history. That gap has shaped everything written about that history in the 50-plus years since. Researchers working from the available record write the history that the available record supports. The history they write becomes the consensus. The consensus becomes what is taught in schools and museums and university courses, and the removed documents become, for most purposes, part of a reality that official history does not acknowledge. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is an observation about how historical knowledge works and how it can be managed. The management of historical knowledge has always been one of the functions of archival institutions, and that management has always served political purposes alongside scholarly ones. The 1,971 removal was an unusually dramatic example of that management, but it was not categorically different from the ordinary operation of archival institutions throughout the colonial period. What makes it unusual is the scale, the timing, and the survival of just enough documentary trace to allow it to be partially reconstructed and discussed. Most acts of archival management of this kind leave no trace at all. There is a question that this entire story eventually forces you to confront, and it is not a comfortable question. If the removed documents contained evidence that the standard narrative of pre-contact North American history is significantly incomplete or significantly wrong in specific ways, what are the implications? The implications depend enormously on what specifically was in those documents, but some possibilities are worth thinking through. If the documents corroborated Indigenous oral traditions about deep pre-contact history in the Canadian North, the implication would be a massive transfer of historical credibility from the colonial documentary record to Indigenous oral traditions. This would not be merely symbolic. It would have practical implications for land claims, for the interpretation of treaties, for the legal frameworks governing Indigenous rights in Canada. These implications are so significant, so potentially transformative of existing legal and economic arrangements, that you can see why they might be viewed as threatening by interests invested in the current framework. If the documents contained evidence of pre-contact contacts between the inhabitants of northern North America and peoples from across the Atlantic or Pacific, the implications would be primarily historical and cultural, but they would still be significant. They would complicate the story of who was here and when, which is a story with political dimensions that are not always obvious from the outside. If the documents described physical evidence of activity in the Canadian North that doesn't fit current archaeological models, the implications would depend heavily on what that activity was and when it occurred. Some possibilities in this space would be merely interesting. Others would require substantial revision of foundational assumptions about North American prehistory. And if the documents describe things that don't fit any of our current frameworks at all, the implications are genuinely difficult to specify in advance. But the government's decision to remove them, rather than publish and address them, suggests that the people who made that decision found the implications unacceptable. There is a specific thread in this story that connects to developments in mainstream archaeology that have occurred in the 50 years since the 1971 removal. Developments that make the question of what was in those documents more important now than it might have seemed then. In the half-century since 1971, archaeology in North America has undergone a genuine revolution in its understanding of pre-contact complexity. The Clovis first model of initial human arrival, which posited that humans first reached the Americas around 13,000 years ago via a specific route through Alaska, has been significantly undermined by a series of sites that demonstrate earlier human presence. Monte Verde, in Chile, with its dates of at least 14,800 years, forced the first major revision. Subsequent sites in various North American locations have pushed the evidence earlier still. The genetic record has transformed the picture even more dramatically. Ancient DNA analysis has revealed that the history of human population movement in the Americas was far more complex than any simple model suggested. There were multiple migration waves. There were populations that arrived early and left little genetic trace in modern populations. There were connections between South American populations and populations in the Pacific that remain incompletely explained. The Americas, it turns out, were settled earlier, in more complex ways, by more diverse populations than the models of 50 years ago suggested. In this context, evidence from the Canadian North about pre-contact activity that didn't fit the models of 1971 might look different today. It might fit into an emerging picture of North American prehistory that is gradually, grudgingly, acknowledging its own complexity. It might, in other words, be evidence whose time has come, but it's locked away somewhere in a restricted federal collection, unavailable to the researchers who are now working with tools and frameworks that might allow them to understand it properly. The story of the 1971 removal is, at its core, a story about power, about who gets to control the historical record, about who benefits from certain versions of the past being accessible and other versions being removed from view, about the relationship between historical knowledge and present-day political and legal arrangements. These are not abstract questions in Canada. The settlement of outstanding Indigenous land claims is one of the defining political and legal processes of the current era. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, many of which remain unimplemented, address the relationship between historical knowledge and present-day justice. The ongoing debates about resource extraction in Northern Territories, about pipeline routes and mining rights and hydroelectric development, all of these debates are shaped by questions about who was here, what happened to them, and what rights flow from that history. The removed documents, wherever they are not historical artifacts in a neutral sense. They are evidence with real present-day implications. Their inaccessibility shapes what can be known and argued and decided about questions that matter to people who are alive right now. This is why the silence around the 1971 removal is not merely frustrating from an academic standpoint. It is a functioning part of an ongoing arrangement. The silence is not a passive absence of information. It is an active state of information control, maintained by legal mechanisms that are themselves the product of political choices. What can you actually do with this story if you're a researcher, a journalist, or simply a citizen who wants to understand it better? The honest answer is that you can do quite a bit, and the people who have done the most have generally followed the same approach. Patient, systematic work through the available record, accepting that most paths will lead to walls while remaining alert to the small gaps through which light sometimes comes. The partial documentary record that exists, the internal memo, the inventory fragments, the freedom of information responses, the researcher memoirs, the graduate dissertations, the legal filings in land claims proceedings, all of this material is accessible in one form or another. None of it alone tells the full story. Together, it tells a partial story that is already significant. The provincial archives are worth examination. The memo that authorized the 1,971 removal specifically mentioned related materials in provincial collections and advised their secondary verification, which means the federal operation was aware of corroborating materials in provincial archives. Those archives were not part of the 1,971 operation. Some of those materials may still be there. The Jesuit relations, extensively digitized and accessible, contain references to specific northern locations that appear to overlap with the geographic coverage of the removed federal files. Cross-referencing these references with other available historical materials can reveal patterns that point toward what was significant about those locations. Indigenous knowledge holders in the affected communities carry traditions that are, in some respects, the original source of much of what went into those removed files. Their traditions haven't been removed. They've been maintained. Engaging respectfully with those traditions, on the terms and with the consent of the communities that hold them, is both ethically appropriate and historically informative. The 1,971 removal has never been formally acknowledged in any government statement. No minister has addressed it in Parliament. No official history of the National Archives mentions it. The institution that is now called Library and Archives Canada, the successor to the Public Archives of Canada, does not acknowledge it in any of its public communications. This is, in itself, a significant fact. Organizations that carry out legitimate administrative operations generally do not have difficulty acknowledging those operations. The persistent official silence about an event that is documented in multiple independent sources is not the behavior of an institution with nothing to hide. The silence is so complete, so consistent across more than 50 years and multiple changes of government that it becomes a kind of negative evidence. What you cannot say, in official contexts, about what happened in 1971 is itself a statement about what happened in 1971. The Government of Canada is not a monolithic entity with a single, continuous consciousness. The federal government of 2024 is not the federal government of 1,000 to 971 inches, any meaningful operational sense. The people who made the decision to remove those documents are mostly dead. The bureaucratic culture that produced that decision has been through multiple reforms and reorganizations. There is no obvious contemporary interest being served by maintaining the silence about an operation that happened half a century ago, except for one, the legal restriction. The 2018 Freedom of Information response cited a provision of the Access to Information Act that restricts materials relevant to outstanding Indigenous rights claims. Those claims are ongoing. The legal framework that requires their restriction has not changed. And as long as those claims are unresolved, the government has a legal basis for maintaining access restrictions that was actually written into law in 2006, well after the original operation. Someone, 35 years after the 1971 removal, ensured that the materials from that operation would be protected by a specific legal framework. That action was intentional, and it requires legal expertise and institutional knowledge that doesn't arise by accident. The broader history of archival suppression of inconvenient historical evidence in Canada is a story with many chapters, of which 1,971 is only one. The history of what happened to residential school records, documentation of abuse and death that was systematically managed to prevent accountability, has received substantial public attention through the Truth and Reconciliation process. The patterns in that story, the deliberate reclassification of potentially incriminating materials, the gaps in records that survivors' testimony suggests should exist, the belated acknowledgements that came only after decades of pressure, are recognizable to anyone familiar with the 1971 archival removal. The history of what happened to records related to the Canadian government's management of Indigenous communities during the most intensive period of residential schools, Indian agents, and cultural suppression from roughly the 1880s through the 1960s is a history with substantial documented gaps. Materials that should exist don't. Materials that do exist are sometimes accessible only in heavily redacted forms. The overall picture suggests systematic records management conducted with awareness of potential future legal and political consequences. The 1971 removal fits this pattern. It happened at the end of the intensive colonial management period, just as that period was beginning to face serious challenge. It happened when the people who had been managing Indigenous communities for generations were confronting the reality that their management was going to be scrutinized and that the record they had created might be used against them. This story has personal dimensions that tend to get lost in the abstractions of archival policy and historical methodology. Consider the federal archivist who was asked, in November of 1971, to help carry boxes of documents to a truck that was waiting behind the building. Who was told that the materials were being transferred and that she didn't need to know where? Who spent 30 years afterward wondering what she had been part of, whether it had been legitimate, whether it had mattered? Who, in retirement, mentioned it in cautious terms to a researcher who asked the right question? Consider the Geological Survey employee who found something in a northern valley that shouldn't have been there, who reported it as he was trained to, who followed the instructions he was given to omit it from the published report, who watched the valley fill with water a few years later, and who never felt entirely at peace with his silence. Consider the Indigenous elder who told an RCMP officer, sometime in the 1950s, about what her grandparents' grandparents had found in a particular place in the landscape. Who gave that officer knowledge that her community had maintained for generations, trusting that the government's record-keeping would preserve it? Who didn't know that what she shared would end up classified and then removed? These individual experiences are not the stuff of dramatic historical revelation. They are the texture of a history that was managed, quietly and at considerable cost to the people whose stories were being managed. Where does this leave us? 6,000 documents removed from Canada's National Archives in November of 1971, removed by people who were operating under instructions from a level of government above the archive's own administration, removed into a restricted collection that apparently still exists somewhere, subject to access restrictions explicitly tied to outstanding Indigenous rights claims, removed in a way that no official source has ever publicly explained or acknowledged. The partial inventory suggests they contain geographic series files for specific northern regions, pre-contact archaeological and historical materials, and northern correspondence files containing transcriptions of Indigenous oral traditions and reports of anomalous discoveries by federal employees. The timing places the removal 2 years before the Calder decision that transformed Indigenous land rights jurisprudence in Canada, in the same period as the intensive industrial development that physically transformed and in many cases permanently flooded the northern landscape. Those documents described the subsequent management of access requests, including a 2018 response that cited a legal provision specifically designed to protect materials relevant to outstanding Indigenous rights claims, suggests the restriction is not merely historical, but is actively maintained for present legal purposes. The silence is institutional, total, and 50 years old. And the history that was in those documents, whatever specifically it was, remains unwritten in any official form. It remains, for now, in 2 places. In whatever restricted collection holds the original materials, and in the oral traditions of the northern communities, whose knowledge those materials, in part, recorded. One of those repositories is controlled by the Canadian federal government and is subject to legal access restrictions that can be maintained indefinitely. The other is not. The oral traditions of Indigenous peoples in the Canadian North do not require archival validation. They exist on their own terms, maintained by their communities, carrying the knowledge of the land and its history in forms that have survived for generations longer than the colonial documentary record that partially transcribed them. When an Innu elder in the interior of Quebec describes a place in the landscape where something happened before the memory of living people, she is not awaiting confirmation from a federal archive. The knowledge is the knowledge. The place is the place. The history is the history. What the removed documents might have provided was not the knowledge itself, but the confirmation in the federal government's own records that federal officials in the 19th and 20th centuries were told about that history, recorded it, and chose to remove it from public access rather than acknowledge it. That confirmation matters legally. It matters politically. It matters in terms of the official acknowledgement that institutional Canada has been, for generations, aware of a history it has systematically declined to accept. It matters because the silence is a choice, and choices can be changed. There is a version of this story that ends with the restricted materials being released, the gaps in the official historical record being filled, the full complexity of pre-contact North American history becoming available to researchers and communities and courts. That version of the story is not impossible. Archives have been opened before, restricted materials have been released before, political and legal contexts change. The 2018 Freedom of Information Response acknowledged the existence of the restricted collection. The legal provision under which it is restricted was enacted in 2006. Legal frameworks change, political priorities change. The ongoing resolution of Indigenous land claims, which is the specific legal context the restriction references, continues to develop and will eventually, in some form, reach conclusion. When those claims are resolved, whatever form that resolution takes, the rationale for the access restriction under the cited provision may no longer apply. That is not a guarantee that the materials will be released, but it removes one of the key legal bases for the restriction. There is also a version of this story that ends with the materials being found to be far less dramatic than the circumstances of their removal suggest. Government archives are full of mundane materials that were restricted for political reasons and turned out, when eventually released, to contain nothing more than embarrassing bureaucratic incompetence or ordinary political calculation. The 1,971 removal may fall into this category, but the specific categories of materials described in the partial inventory, the pre-contact evidence, the Northern Correspondence files, the geographic series, these are not categories that typically accumulate mundane bureaucratic content. These are categories where the interesting and the inconvenient tend to concentrate. And the specific legal framework under which access to the restricted collection is currently maintained is one that references Indigenous rights claims, not departmental embarrassment. That specificity suggests that whoever drafted the legal language in 2006 knew what they were protecting and why. The Canadian landscape itself is a kind of archive. The rivers that the geographic series files described still flow. The shield rock that the geological surveys mapped is still there. The lakes and valleys that weren't flooded still exist in the forms they had in 1971. The anomalous formations that different categories of official observers noticed and reported are, in many cases, still there to be noticed. What has changed is that we no longer have the official documentary context that would allow us to understand how those formations were understood by the people who had the institutional knowledge to assess them. We have lost the metadata, the official records that would allow present-day researchers to situate field observations within the broader pattern of what was known and investigated and classified. But the landscape itself is patient. It doesn't file access requests. It doesn't maintain legal restrictions. It just exists, carrying in its physical form the traces of everything that has happened on it, if you know how to look. Indigenous peoples know how to look. They have been looking at this landscape for thousands of years, developing knowledge about it that no colonial archive could fully capture, even if it tried. The removal of 6,000 federal documents did not remove that knowledge. It simply maintained a separation between the colonial documentary record and the Indigenous knowledge that the colonial record had partially and imperfectly transcribed. That separation has served the interests of the colonial legal framework. Whether it continues to serve those interests is a question that the ongoing resolution of land rights claims and the broader project of reconciliation will continue to put pressure on. In the end, what this story asks of us is not to resolve the mystery, but to take it seriously. To take seriously the fact that 6,000 documents were removed from Canada's National Archives in 1971 and that no one has ever explained why. To take seriously the pattern of archival management that the removal represents and the larger colonial history of which that pattern is a part. To take seriously the Indigenous knowledge traditions that carry, on their own terms and without requiring official validation, the history that the official record chose to remove. And to take seriously the silence, not as a final answer, but as itself a piece of evidence. A piece of evidence about what was in those documents, about why they mattered enough to remove, and about what interests have been served, for 50 years, by keeping them inaccessible. The silence speaks. If you know how to listen to it. The researcher who found the 2003 memo, the internal document that first confirmed elements of the 1971 operation, has said in a subsequent interview that finding it was not a dramatic moment. She was working through administrative correspondence files, looking for something entirely unrelated. The memo was in a folder with other interoffice materials, unremarkable in its physical appearance. She almost skipped past it. What stopped her was the phrase, the pre-contact materials. In the context of internal archival administrative correspondence from the early 1970s, that phrase was unusual. It implied a category of materials that the Archives organization itself didn't officially acknowledge in its public-facing documentation. She pulled the folder and read the memo carefully. Then she read it again. She made a photocopy and took it home. She spent several weeks verifying that what she was reading was what it appeared to be. Then she began the process of following the threads it offered. She describes it now as one of those moments in archival research where you suddenly understand that the silence you've been working around isn't an absence, but a presence. That the shape of what isn't there tells you as much as the shape of what is. That history is not only what was written down, but also what was removed. 6,000 documents removed from Canada's National Archives in November of 1971. Nobody will say what was in them, but the silence says plenty, and there is still so much more to tell. Because the 1971 removal is not a standalone event. It connects to a web of related suppressions, related silences, related moments when the official record of Canada's engagement with its own pre-contact past was shaped by what was taken out rather than what was put in. The removal connects to the decisions made by the Geological Survey of Canada throughout the 20th century about which findings from northern field surveys made it into published reports and which were classified or suppressed. A systematic review of what is not in those published reports, compared to what field logs and preliminary survey documents suggest should be there, has never been conducted. It would require a level of archival access and institutional cooperation that has not been forthcoming. The removal connects to the history of what happened to ethnographic materials collected by federal researchers working in Indigenous communities throughout the early to mid-20th century. These researchers gathered enormous quantities of material, oral traditions, ceremonial knowledge, accounts of specific places and events, and this material entered the federal collection system. Some of it has been returned to communities. Some of it is inaccessible. Some of it appears to have been removed in operations similar to 1971's, operations that are even less well documented. The removal connects to the specific history of northern Quebec and the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, the 1975 settlement that addressed some of the land claims of the Cree and Inuit peoples of the region in exchange for the formal approval of the hydroelectric projects that flooded the northern landscape. That agreement has been the subject of ongoing interpretation and litigation ever since. The historical documentation of pre-contact land use in the affected regions, which would have been directly relevant to the agreement's negotiation, is precisely the category of material that appears in the partial inventory of the 1971 removal. The removal connects to a network of small institutions and private collections that quietly absorbed Canadian historical materials outside the official archival system throughout the 20th century. Some of these are religious institutions with historical ties to the missionary correspondence that fed into the northern files. Some are corporate archives associated with the resource extraction companies that operated in the north. Some are private collections, assembled by individuals who, for various reasons, were positioned to acquire materials that weren't supposed to be circulating. These networks are difficult to investigate and nearly impossible to comprehensively map, but they exist. And some of them may hold materials that illuminate, corroborate, or contradict what the official archive contained before 1971. The Jesuit connection deserves more space, because the historical depth it opens up is extraordinary. The Society of Jesus established its mission network in New France in the early 17th century. The missionaries who went north were remarkable individuals, highly educated, disciplined, and possessed of a genuine intellectual curiosity about the landscapes and peoples they encountered. Their reports, the Jesuit Relations, published annually in Paris from 1632 to 1673, are among the most important primary sources for understanding the early contact period in New France. But the published Relations were not the complete record of what the missionaries wrote. They were edited versions, shaped by considerations of what the Jesuit leadership in Paris wanted to publicize and what they preferred to keep within the society. The internal correspondence, the letters that traveled between missions and regional superiors and Rome, contained things that the published Relations did not. Some of that internal correspondence made it into various archives over the centuries. Some of it remained in Jesuit institutional collections, and some of it described, in terms that the Society's historians have generally treated as either metaphorical or simply strange, experiences and observations in the northern landscape that don't fit easily into conventional historical categories. One category of these accounts involves descriptions of structures or physical features in the landscape that the missionaries' indigenous guides identified as of great antiquity and non-indigenous origin. Not all indigenous peoples of the Northeast had traditions of building in stone. When early missionaries encountered stone structures in regions where the contemporary indigenous population didn't build in stone, and when their guides told them these structures predated the memory of anyone living, the missionaries wrote about it. They wrote about it in different ways, some with theological interpretations, some with ethnographic precision, some with simple puzzlement, but they wrote about it. These accounts exist in the Jesuit Relations. They exist in other early colonial documentation, and they point to specific locations in northern Quebec and Ontario that are the same locations that appear in the Geographic Series files of the 1971 removal. The continuity of documentation from 17th century missionaries to 19th and early 20th century federal correspondence to the pre-construction surveys of mid-20th century hydroelectric projects, all pointing to the same specific northern locations, is one of the most striking patterns in this entire story. Something was at those locations. Multiple independent observers, across 3 centuries, noticed it and wrote about it. And then, comprehensively and apparently deliberately, the documentation was removed, the landscapes were flooded, and the communities that carried the oral knowledge of those places were resettled away from them. The question of what those locations might have contained leads into territory that mainstream academic historical scholarship is deeply reluctant to enter, for reasons that are partly methodological and partly political. The methodological reluctance is understandable. Archaeology is a discipline built on physical evidence, and the physical evidence from flooded or inaccessible northern locations is by definition unavailable for direct examination. Arguments based on convergent documentary evidence from different historical periods are suggestive but not conclusive. Responsible academic practice requires maintaining the distinction between what can be demonstrated and what can only be inferred. The political reluctance is less easy to defend. The question of what was at those locations is directly relevant to ongoing Indigenous rights litigation. The mainstream archaeological establishment's reluctance to seriously engage with questions about pre-contact North American complexity, particularly in the Canadian North, serves the interests of the colonial legal framework that benefits from a simplified historical narrative. Whether that service is intentional or merely structural is a question about professional culture that archaeologists themselves are better positioned to answer than outside critics. What can be said is that the convergent evidence points toward locations in the Canadian North that were significant, for various reasons, to multiple categories of historical observer across a very long time period. That significance may have been purely cultural or religious. It may have been related to specific natural features of those locations. It may have been related to physical evidence of pre-contact activity that no longer survives in accessible form. Or it may have been related to something else entirely that none of the available categories of explanation fully account for. The documents that might have clarified this question are inaccessible. The physical sites are flooded. The communities that carried the relevant oral traditions have been displaced. And the academic establishment that might otherwise engage with these questions has, for reasons that are themselves historically interesting, chosen not to. Every generation of Canadian researchers who engages with this story finds the same things. Enough to know that something significant was removed and suppressed, not enough to say definitively what that something was. This is not accidental. The management of the 1971 removal and its aftermath has been precise in a way that suggests institutional learning. Each access request is responded to in terms that acknowledge the event without providing the specific information that would make its contents reconstructible. Each legal framework that restricts the materials is specific enough to be defensible under access to information law, while broad enough to cover the full range of what might be sensitive. The institutional knowledge that produced this management approach didn't arise by accident. It required people who understood the legal framework, understood what was in the materials, and understood what disclosing it would mean. That kind of institutional knowledge is itself a historical artifact. It was acquired at some point, passed to successors in some form, and has been maintained across 50 years and multiple changes of government. The existence of that institutional knowledge and the effort required to maintain it is itself evidence about the significance of the removed materials. Organizations don't expend institutional energy maintaining secrets about things that don't matter. The 50 years of careful management of information about the 1971 removal is, in its own way, the most compelling evidence that what was removed was important. The final thread in this story is the one that connects all the others, and it is the thread of time. Canada's pre-contact history extends back at least 15,000 years, possibly much longer. The period covered by colonial documentation represents perhaps 200 of those years, roughly 1.5% of the human presence on this land. The period covered by formal federal archives represents about 150 years, 1%. In that 1% of recorded time, something happened that the federal government considered significant enough to remove 6,000 documents about it. Something that connected to the other 99%, to the deep time before the colonial period, to what was there before, to what the land knows that the official record doesn't say. Whatever was in those documents is not merely historical, it is present. The landscape that those documents described is still there, at least in the parts that weren't flooded. The oral traditions that those documents partially transcribed are still alive in the communities that carry them. The legal questions that the removal was designed to suppress are still actively being argued in courts across the country. The past that was suppressed in 1971 is not safely past. It is the past that shapes the present. The question of what was in those documents is not an antiquarian puzzle. It is a question about what Canada is willing to know about itself, and about whether the suppression of 50 years ago will hold for another 50. There are people working on this, quietly, patiently, following threads through archives and legal filings and community conversations, building the partial picture that can be built from the materials that are accessible, waiting for the pieces that are not accessible yet. The silence is 50 years old, but silence doesn't last forever. 6,000 documents, removed from Canada's National Archives in November of 1971. Never explained, never acknowledged by any official source, maintained under legal restriction in a collection that has not been publicly identified, subject to access provisions tied to outstanding Indigenous rights claims that have not been fully resolved. Pre-contact materials, Northern correspondence files, geographic series from specific northern regions that were subsequently flooded or developed. A government that has spent 50 years not answering questions about what it did and why. A landscape that was systematically altered to prevent physical corroboration of what the documents described. Communities whose oral traditions carry the knowledge that the documents transcribed and whose relationship to the land that knowledge describes has been shaped by the same forces that suppressed the documentary record. A web of converging historical evidence, from 17th century missionaries to 20th century geological surveyors, all pointing to specific locations in the Canadian North that no longer exist in accessible form, and a silence so complete, so consistent, so carefully maintained that it has become, over 50 years, the most eloquent thing about this story. Whatever was in those documents, it mattered enough to remove. It mattered enough to maintain restrictions on for half a century. It mattered enough that whoever wrote the internal memo in November of 1971 worried about future inquiries and took steps to prevent them from succeeding. It mattered enough that someone, in 2006, wrote the specific language that protects it under current law. The history of Canada, before Europeans arrived, is not the blank that official narratives suggest. It is a deep, complex, multi-layered story that this land has been trying to tell for thousands of years, through its landscapes, through the oral traditions of its peoples, through the traces left in soil and stone and water. 6,000 documents once held part of that story. They're still out there, and one day, the silence will break. Let's go further, because the story doesn't end with the documents themselves, it begins with them. To understand what might have been worth suppressing in Canada's pre-contact North, you have to understand what the land itself has been saying for millennia, and you have to be willing to take seriously a category of evidence that mainstream historical scholarship has consistently, stubbornly, and sometimes aggressively refused to engage with. That category is called convergent anomaly. It's not a technical term from any established discipline. It's a description of a pattern. When multiple independent sources, from different historical periods, speaking different languages, operating from different cultural frameworks, all point to the same anomalous feature of the same landscape, that convergence is not easily explained by coincidence. It demands attention. The Canadian North is full of convergent anomalies. Not at every river bend, not everywhere you look, but in specific places, specific regions, specific geological features, you find the same pattern repeating. Something was noticed, something was recorded, and then the record was managed. Let's go back to the land itself for a moment, because the geography of the Canadian North is one of the most important characters in this story, and it rarely gets the attention it deserves. The Canadian Shield is the oldest exposed rock on the surface of the planet. Parts of it date to nearly 4 billion years ago. It has been above water, more or less continuously, for longer than complex life has existed on Earth. It covers roughly 8 million square kilometres, an area larger than Australia, spanning from the eastern Arctic through Quebec and Ontario and into Manitoba and Saskatchewan, with extensions northward into the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. This ancient rock has been scraped and shaped by ice sheets that advanced and retreated many times over the past million years. The last major glaciation ended roughly 10,000 years ago. As the ice retreated, it left behind a landscape of extraordinary complexity. Thousands of lakes, river systems that drain in patterns shaped by glacial geology rather than simple topography. Eskers, long sinuous ridges of sorted gravel deposited by rivers flowing beneath the ice. Drumlins, low elongated hills shaped by ice movement. And in some areas, features that don't fit easily into the standard glacial geology catalogue. Geologists who work in the Shield regularly encounter things that puzzle them, things that the standard explanatory framework of glacial deposition and bedrock dynamics doesn't fully account for. Most of these puzzles are resolved through additional fieldwork or through the application of more sophisticated analytical tools. But some are filed away as anomalies pending further investigation, and the further investigation doesn't always come. When you overlay the geographical distribution of filed but unresolved geological anomalies in the Canadian Shield with the geographical coverage of the 1,971 removed documents, the overlap is not complete, but it is not random. There is a specific geological feature type that appears in this overlap zone that deserves particular attention. Throughout the Canadian Shield, in a geographic band running roughly from northern Ontario through central Quebec, there are numerous occurrences of what geologists call anomalous lithic distributions. accumulations of stone in patterns that don't match the expected results of glacial transport and deposition. These accumulations tend to be linear or curvilinear in form. They tend to be concentrated in areas with specific topographic characteristics, elevated positions overlooking water bodies, narrow valleys between higher ground, the heads of river systems. The standard geological interpretation of these features varies. Some are attributed to frost heave patterns that can create organized stone arrangements under certain conditions. Some are attributed to differential erosion of underlying bedrock structures. Some are attributed to relatively recent indigenous activity, stone gathering for construction or for spiritual purposes. But some are not satisfactorily explained by any of these mechanisms. They are too large. They are in positions that don't match the expected patterns of frost, heave, or erosion. They don't match the architectural traditions of the indigenous cultures of the region in the periods for which we have records. And they are located, in several cases, in the same places that the Jesuit missionaries described, the geological surveyors described, the Northern Correspondence Files apparently described, and the Geographic Series documents apparently described. The convergence of independent observers across centuries, all pointing to the same unusual feature in the same locations, is not a function of geological processes. It's a function of something being there, something that multiple categories of observer, with different tools, different training, different purposes, all noticed and documented. What that something is, was, or represents, is the question that the removed documents might have helped answer. In 2011, a team of remote sensing researchers at a Canadian university published a paper in a minor geological journal that created a brief stir among a small community of SHIELD researchers and then largely disappeared from view. The paper used LiDAR, light detection and ranging, aerial laser scanning technology that can see through vegetation to map the surface beneath, to survey a section of northern Ontario that had previously been surveyed only by traditional ground-based methods. LiDAR is transformative for landscape analysis because it reveals surface features invisible to human observers walking through dense boreal forest. Features that would require months of ground-based survey work to map can be identified from LiDAR data in hours. The 2011 paper described, in careful and hedged language, a series of linear and curvilinear features in the survey area that the researchers could not attribute to any known natural process. The features were consistent in their dimensions and spacing in ways that suggested systematic construction. They were located in topographic positions that had specific characteristics, elevated with respect to surrounding terrain, with lines of sight to prominent landscape features. The researchers concluded that the features required ground-based investigation to determine their origin. They recommended follow-up survey work. The paper was peer-reviewed and published. The follow-up survey work was never funded. Several of the features described in the 2011 paper are in the geographic coverage zone of the 1,971 removed documents. LiDAR is changing pre-contact archaeology around the world. In Guatemala, it revealed an entire Maya urban landscape hidden beneath rainforest canopy, a discovery that transformed understanding of Mayan civilization. In Cambodia, it revealed the extent of the Khmer Empire's urban sprawl around Angkor Wat. In Honduras, it guided researchers to the remains of a lost city in the Mesquicia jungle. In Canada's north, LiDAR surveys of sufficient coverage and resolution have been conducted primarily by resource extraction companies assessing potential development areas and by government agencies conducting environmental assessments. The results of those surveys are not all publicly available. Company surveys are proprietary data. Government surveys are subject to normal archival access rules, which in some cases include the kind of restricted access provisions that have protected the 1,971 removal. The SHIELD surveys that would be most relevant to the questions raised by the 1971 removal have not been systematically conducted by institutions with a mandate to make the results publicly available and archaeologically interpreted. The technology exists, the access exists. The mandate and the political will do not. This is not a conspiracy. It is a resource allocation decision made within a system that has consistently treated certain questions about Canadian pre-contact history as not worth investing in. The reasons for that treatment are complex, but they are not neutral. Let's talk about water, because water is central to this story in multiple dimensions. Water destroyed the evidence in the form of the hydroelectric reservoirs that flooded the northern landscape. Water preserved the evidence in the form of lake sediment cores that can sometimes retain traces of human activity in their layered deposits, traces that can survive flooding and that are recoverable by coring from research vessels. Water transported the people who, across thousands of years, moved through the northern landscape using river systems as highways. The river systems of the Canadian Shield form one of the most comprehensive natural transportation networks on the continent. The canoe routes of the fur trade era were not invented by European traders. They were learned from indigenous peoples who had been using those routes for thousands of years before European contact. And water, specifically the pattern of water bodies in the northern landscape, is one of the consistent features associated with the locations that appear in the convergent anomaly pattern. The sites that multiple independent observers noticed across multiple centuries tend to be associated with specific water features. River junctions, narrows where lakes drain into river systems, elevated positions overlooking confluences, the heads of portage routes between watersheds. This geographic pattern is consistent with sites that would have had strategic or logistical significance for anyone moving through the landscape, places where travelers stopped, places where communities gathered, places where exchange happened, places where things were built. The removed documents' geographic series files were organized by region, and the regions they covered included some of the most significant water system features of the Northern Shield. The indigenous peoples who have lived in these regions for thousands of years have names for those significant places. They have stories about them. They have knowledge about what happened there and what can still happen there. Some of those places are actively maintained by their communities as significant sites. Some have become inaccessible due to the hydroelectric projects, and some are places that community members are reluctant to discuss with outsiders, not because of any legal restriction, but because the knowledge of those places is sacred and is not for general distribution. This dimension of the story requires a different kind of care than the archival and geological dimensions. The oral traditions and spiritual knowledge of northern indigenous communities are not public domain. They are not research objects for non-indigenous scholars to extract and analyze. They belong to the communities that maintain them, and engagement with them is appropriate only on those communities' terms. What can be said, without appropriating specific knowledge, is that northern indigenous communities have consistently maintained that the landscape they inhabit has a history much deeper and more complex than the official narrative acknowledges. They have said this in legal proceedings. They have said this in public statements. They have said this in conversations with researchers who have approached them respectfully and with appropriate protocols. And they have consistently pointed to the 1,971 removal and to the broader pattern of archival and physical suppression it represents as evidence of a systematic effort to prevent that deeper history from being publicly acknowledged. That indigenous assessment of the situation is not merely one perspective among many to be weighed against official denials. It is the perspective of the communities whose history was suppressed. It carries a specific kind of authority that no amount of archival analysis can replace. In 2015, an Indigenous-led research project in northern Quebec began systematically mapping oral historical traditions associated with specific landscape features in their traditional territory. The project combined community knowledge with satellite imagery and historical documentation to create what the project leaders described as a layered historical atlas of their homeland. In the course of that project, the researchers documented oral traditions associated with several locations that had been flooded by hydroelectric projects in the 1970s. Those oral traditions described the locations in terms that included references to features, structures, or objects that the oral accounts attributed to the ones who were there before, a category that the elders consulted were careful to distinguish from both the current community's own ancestors and from any known historical indigenous culture. The ones who were there before are a feature of oral traditions across multiple northern indigenous cultures. They appear in different accounts under different names and with different attributes, but the basic concept is consistent. There were people in this landscape before the people who are here now. They left things behind. Some of those things are still here. Others have been taken or destroyed. The research project's report was published in a community-focused format in 2016. It was not widely disseminated in academic channels, partly because it wasn't structured for academic publication and partly because its content didn't fit comfortably into any established academic framework. Several copies are in Indigenous community archives and in the library of a university Indigenous Studies program. The locations described in the oral traditions documented by that project include several that appear in the Geographic Series entries in the 1971 partial inventory. Let's step back and think about the long arc of what we've been discussing, because individual threads can obscure the shape of the whole story. What we are looking at when we look at the 1971 removal in its full context is a specific episode in a much longer process of historical management that has characterized Canada's relationship with its pre-contact past from the earliest period of colonial administration. That process has operated through multiple mechanisms simultaneously: physical removal of evidence through development projects, documentary suppression through archival operations, legal suppression through access restrictions, cultural suppression through residential schools and other mechanisms that severed Indigenous communities from the knowledge traditions that carried their history, academic suppression through the institutional structures of disciplines that controlled who could make authoritative claims about pre-contact history and what methods counted as legitimate. These mechanisms didn't require coordination to be effective. They could operate independently and still converge on the same result, because they were all expressions of the same underlying assumption: that the pre-contact history of North America was a relatively simple story, adequately described by the existing academic and official frameworks, and that evidence suggesting otherwise was either wrong or irrelevant. That assumption has been the operating premise of Canadian official history for as long as there has been a Canadian official history. It shaped what was preserved and what wasn't, what was published and what wasn't, what was accessible and what wasn't, what was funded for research and what wasn't. And in November of 1971, when that assumption was beginning to face serious challenge from Indigenous rights movements and legal proceedings, a specific and dramatic episode of documentary suppression removed 6,000 documents from the public record. The relationship between the 1971 removal and the broader process of historical management is important to understand, precisely because it prevents the removal from being treated as an isolated incident, a bureaucratic error, or a specific political decision that can be addressed and corrected in isolation. The removal was an episode in a long history. Correcting it, if correction ever comes, will require engaging not just with the specific question of those 6,000 documents, but with the entire apparatus of historical management that the removal reflects and serves. This is why the official response to questions about the removal has consistently been so limited. Acknowledging the removal in any meaningful way means acknowledging the larger history of which it is a part. And acknowledging that history means acknowledging that the official narrative of pre-contact North America, as it has been taught in schools and validated in courts and enshrined in legal frameworks for generations, was constructed through a systematic process of managing what was accessible and what wasn't. That acknowledgement has implications that extend far beyond any specific archival question. It has implications for land rights, for treaty interpretation, for the legal and constitutional framework within which Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state relate to each other. These implications are not ones that any federal government has found it easy to embrace. And so the silence continues. There is a particular irony in the fact that some of the best available evidence for what was in the removed documents comes not from the Canadian archival system, but from archives in other countries. The Jesuit relations, as noted, were published in Paris. The originals are in Rome. Some of the early colonial documentation that describes northern landscape features was produced by observers who reported not to Ottawa, but to London or to Paris, or to their religious orders. Some of that documentation has never entered the Canadian federal archival system at all and is accessible in European archives that have their own policies and their own accessibility frameworks. Researchers who have worked in those European archives have found materials that are suggestive, references to specific northern locations in early missionary correspondence that didn't make it into the published relations. Survey reports from early colonial expeditions that describe landscape features in language consistent with the pattern we've been tracing. Correspondence between early colonial administrators and their superiors in Europe that references information about the northern landscape that is phrased in terms suggesting it was understood to be sensitive, even in the 17th century. None of this European archival material has been systematically compared to the Canadian Federal Archival Record, specifically with reference to identifying what the federal record should contain that it doesn't. That kind of comparative analysis would require a research project of substantial scope. It hasn't been done. Its potential to illuminate the contours of the 1971 removal is one more reason why it should be. The Treaty History of Canada provides another angle on the 1971 removal that has received insufficient attention. The numbered treaties, negotiated between the federal government and various First Nations across Western Canada from the 1870s through the early 1920s, were premised on specific understandings of land history and land use. Those understandings, as embodied in the treaties, reflected the official historical narrative of their time, a narrative that positioned pre-contact North America as effectively terra nullius from a legal standpoint, land without owners, available for colonial appropriation, with the provision of negotiated settlements to the peoples currently inhabiting it. That legal framework has been challenged in the decades since the 1970s, partly on the basis of historical evidence about the depth and continuity of Indigenous land use. The challenges have had varying degrees of success. But a consistent feature of the strongest challenges has been the attempt to introduce historical documentation of land use and occupation that predates the treaty era and establishes a baseline of Indigenous presence and land relationship that the treaty framework didn't adequately account. For, the Northern Correspondence Files, as a body of material, would have been directly relevant to treaty-related land claims. They documented federal officials' observations of Indigenous land use and land knowledge over nearly a century of Northern administration. They included accounts of what Indigenous community members told those officials about the history of specific places. In a legal context focused on establishing historical land use and occupation, this category of documentation would be valuable. Its removal from accessible archives would serve the interests of any party that preferred to limit the historical evidence available for such challenges. The timing of the removal, as has been noted, coincides with the period when this category of legal challenge was beginning to develop in earnest. The Calder case was working its way through the courts. The emerging Indigenous rights legal movement was beginning to develop the evidentiary strategies that would define the field for decades. The federal government, through its legal counsel, understood what was at stake. One question that rarely gets asked in discussions of the 1971 removal is, who within the federal government pushed for it? The removal required authorization from a level above the National Archives Administration. It required logistical planning. It required identifying the specific materials to be removed, which in turn required familiarity with the contents and significance of the archive's holdings. And it required ensuring that the operation was carried out without publicity or documentation that would create a clear record of what happened and why. None of these elements arise spontaneously. Someone identified the need, someone assessed what to take, someone coordinated the operation, and someone, presumably, briefed a sufficiently senior official to authorize it. The partial documentary record doesn't identify any of these individuals clearly. The unsigned memo, with its initial and its careful bureaucratic language, gives no names. The accounts of retired archivists who participated in the operation describe receiving instructions through administrative channels without identifying the original source. But the operation's character, its precision, its focus on specific categories of material with specific geographic coverage, suggests it was planned by someone who understood the contents of the archives in considerable detail. This was not a political official making a broad decision to suppress potentially embarrassing historical material. It was someone with specific knowledge of what specific materials contained and specific reasons for believing those materials needed to be removed. The most likely institutional home for this kind of knowledge and this kind of purpose is the legal apparatus of the federal government. Justice Canada, or its predecessor institutions, would have been in the process of analysing the evidentiary landscape for the developing Indigenous rights legal challenges. Their analysis would have included an assessment of what documentary evidence in federal collections could be relevant to those challenges. And their recommendations about how to manage that landscape might well have included the identification of specific archival materials that should be restricted. This is speculation. But it is informed speculation, grounded in an understanding of how legal strategy works and of the institutional structures that would have been engaged in managing the legal dimensions of the emerging Indigenous rights challenge. The question of what happened to the removed materials after their transfer from the National Archives has several possible answers, each with different implications. The first possibility, destruction, would mean the materials are gone, permanently. The information they contained exists only in whatever other sources might corroborate it. The legal case for restricting them under the Indigenous rights claims provision would be moot if they no longer exist, which raises interesting questions about whether the restriction cited in the 2018 the Freedom of Information response is genuine or is itself a form of management of the inquiry. The second possibility, transfer to a restricted federal collection, would mean the materials exist somewhere in the federal holding system, accessible only to those with appropriate clearance levels. The 2018 response reference to an ongoing access review, consistent with the Indigenous rights claims, provision supports this possibility. It suggests the materials are not destroyed, but are under active restriction. The third possibility, transfer to a non-federal custodian, is the most speculative but not without some support in the documentary record. The 2003 memo's reference to secondary verification of related materials in provincial collections might be read as suggesting that the materials were not simply moved within the federal system, but were distributed to different custodians, possibly including provincial institutions or other organisations with relevant holdings. A fourth possibility that researchers have occasionally raised is that the materials were transferred to a foreign jurisdiction. This would be unusual, but not unprecedented for certain categories of sensitive Canadian government materials during the Cold War period. If the materials contained something that was understood to have significance beyond Canadian domestic politics, their management might have involved international dimensions. None of these possibilities can be definitively confirmed or excluded on the basis of available evidence. The 2018 Freedom of Information response's reference to ongoing access review is consistent with the second possibility, but doesn't rule out others. There are moments in this research that remind you how recent all of this history really is, and how many of the people who could provide direct testimony are still living or have only recently died. The archivists who participated in the 1971 operation would have been adults at the time, old enough to have professional responsibility for their actions. They would be in their late 70s, 80s, or 90s today, if alive. Some have given partial accounts to researchers, speaking carefully and anonymously about what they remember. Some have never spoken about it. Some have died without speaking. The federal officials who authorized the removal would have been, in most cases, older than the archivists who carried it out. Most are gone now. But some left papers, some spoke to historians or journalists over the years, some left materials in their own personal archives or in the collections of political parties or government departments that might contain references to the operation. The Indigenous elders, who were the ultimate sources of much of the Northern correspondence files, who told their stories to RCMP officers and Indian agents and missionaries over the decades that those files covered, are also, most of them, gone. But the knowledge they carried has been transmitted forward. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren carry it now. The oral traditions they maintained didn't end with them. The convergence of documentary silence and oral continuation is one of the defining features of this story. The colonial documentary record was managed to suppress specific categories of historical evidence. The Indigenous oral traditions that were the original source of much of that evidence were not destroyed by the suppression of their documentary reflections. They continued, in the communities that maintained them, carrying the knowledge of the landscape and its history in forms that no archival operation could touch. Let's talk about the relationship between this story and the broader global history of Indigenous knowledge suppression, because Canada is not unique in this pattern. Across the colonized world, the management of pre-contact historical evidence has been a consistent feature of colonial administration. In Australia, evidence of Aboriginal presence in specific landscapes was systematically obscured in ways that served the terra nullius legal doctrine that denied Indigenous land rights. In South America, pre-Columbian historical complexity was minimized by colonial institutions that preferred a simpler narrative. In the American Southwest, specific archaeological sites were managed in ways that served the interests of contemporary land arrangements rather than the interests of historical accuracy. In each of these cases, the same basic pattern applies. Official institutions controlled access to evidence. Evidence that complicated the preferred narrative was restricted, suppressed, or removed. Indigenous communities maintained oral traditions that carried the suppressed knowledge, and the suppression served specific political and legal interests that were not incidental to the colonial project but were central to it. Canada's 1,971 removal fits this global pattern with uncomfortable precision. It is an instance of a pattern that appears wherever colonial administrations have found themselves confronted with historical evidence that challenges the legal and political frameworks they depend on. Understanding this global pattern doesn't make the specific Canadian instance less significant. It makes it more significant because it reveals that the 1,971 removal was not an aberration or an anomaly within Canadian historical practice. It was a typical example of colonial archival management applied to a specific situation. The year 1971 was a particular kind of year in Canada. We've mentioned the October Crisis and the War Measures Act. But 1971 had other dimensions that are relevant to this story. It was the year that the White Paper on Indian Policy, Pierre Trudeau's 1969 proposal to eliminate Indian status and the legal framework of the Indian Act, was formally withdrawn following massive Indigenous opposition. The White Paper's failure was a significant moment in the history of Indigenous political mobilization in Canada. It demonstrated that Indigenous peoples could successfully resist federal policy proposals through organized political action, and it set the stage for the expanded Indigenous rights activism that would follow through the 1970s. The federal government, in the aftermath of the White Paper's failure, was recalibrating its approach to Indigenous affairs. It could no longer simply propose the elimination of Indigenous legal status and expect compliance. It was going to have to engage with Indigenous rights claims in a more nuanced way, but it could still manage the evidentiary landscape within which those claims would be argued. The 1,971 removal can be read as part of that recalibration. Having failed to eliminate the legal framework of Indigenous rights through direct policy proposal, the federal government was managing the historical evidence that might be used to strengthen specific rights claims within that framework. Not eliminating the framework, but shaping the terrain on which it would operate. This reading situates the removal within a coherent strategic logic, a logic that doesn't require bad faith or dramatic conspiracy, only the ordinary calculation of institutional self-interest operating in a politically charged environment. The physical act of removing 6,000 documents from a building requires practical planning that most people don't think about when they consider the implications of the operation. 6,000 documents of the kind that would be found in an archival collection from this period would occupy a substantial physical volume. Depending on the nature of the documents, their format, whether they were loose papers or bound volumes or folios, the collection could weigh several tons and fill multiple rooms of boxes or file drawers. Moving that volume of material without attracting attention would require careful logistics. It would require vehicles, personnel, a destination prepared to receive the materials, and some kind of internal management of the operation that kept it from being noticed by the general archival staff or by researchers who had regular access to the collection. The fact that the operation was carried out without, apparently, attracting immediate public attention suggests it was well planned. It also suggests that the people who carried it out understood the institutional environment well enough to know how to operate within it without triggering the kinds of questions that would have generated a documentary trail. This level of institutional sophistication supports the interpretation that the operation was planned by people with deep knowledge of the archive's operations and culture, and with sufficient institutional authority to direct archive staff without generating significant resistance. The question of who knew about the 1,971 removal at the time is different from the question of who authorized it. The people who carried out the physical operation, the archivists, and other staff who moved the boxes, clearly knew something unusual was happening. The people who worked in adjacent areas of the archives, who may have noticed the activity or been aware of the missing materials afterward, may have drawn their own conclusions. Researchers who visited the collection before and after the operation may have noticed gaps without understanding their cause. This diffuse awareness, partial and indirect, without anyone having the full picture or feeling able to speak about it, is characteristic of institutional suppression operations. Nobody is in the position of knowing the complete story except the people at the very center of the operation, and those people have reasons to stay silent. Everyone else knows a piece of it, enough to be uneasy, not enough to be certain. The result is a kind of collective institutional knowledge that is never articulated as knowledge, because doing so would require assembling the pieces in a way that no single person is positioned to do without taking a significant professional and personal risk. This is why it took until 2003 for a researcher to find the internal memo, not because no one else had access to the same archival spaces, but because no one had approached the specific material with the specific knowledge and the specific purpose that made the memo recognizable for what it was. The memo was always there. It was waiting for someone to know what they were looking at. What does it mean to live with a history that has been suppressed? This question is not abstract for the indigenous communities of the Canadian North. It is the lived reality of communities that know, through their own maintained traditions, that the landscape they inhabit has a history more complex and more significant than the official narrative acknowledges. That carry, in their stories and their relationships with specific places, a knowledge of things that happened here that the federal government once bothered to document and then decided to remove. There is a kind of cognitive dissonance in that experience. The knowledge is real, the places are real, the traditions are alive and functioning. But the official world, the world of schools and courts and government offices, operates on the basis of a historical framework that systematically excludes that knowledge, that treats it as legend or mythology rather than as historical evidence. That was shaped in part by the deliberate removal of the documentary records that might have forced the official world to take the knowledge seriously. That dissonance is not simply academic. It shapes the experience of people trying to assert rights before courts that are limited to evaluating documented evidence. It shapes the experience of community members whose knowledge of their homeland is described, in official contexts, as inadequate to establish legal claims. It shapes the relationship between Indigenous communities and the federal institutions that both manage their affairs and manage the historical record that defines the framework within which their affairs are managed. The 1,971 removal is part of the machinery that produces that dissonance. Understanding it as such is essential to understanding what the removal actually means and what correcting it might require. Let's talk about what would actually need to happen for the full story to come out. At the simplest level, it would require the restricted collection to be identified, located, and made accessible to researchers. This could happen through several mechanisms: a political decision to release the materials, a successful legal challenge under access to information law, a change in the legal framework governing the restriction, a court order in the context of a land claims proceeding that required the government to disclose the materials as relevant evidence. Each of these mechanisms is theoretically available. Each of them is also, in practice, constrained by factors that make the simple availability of the mechanism insufficient to guarantee the outcome. The political decision mechanism requires a government willing to engage with the full implications of what the materials contain. No Canadian federal government has so far demonstrated that willingness with respect to the 1,971 removal. The access to information challenge mechanism is constrained by the specific legal provision under which the materials are restricted, which provides grounds for indefinite restriction as long as relevant rights claims remain unresolved. A legal challenge to that provision would require arguing that the provision itself is unconstitutional. a significant legal undertaking with uncertain prospects. The court order mechanism requires a land claims proceeding in which a party successfully argues that the restricted materials are relevant evidence. This is the most promising path, but it requires identifying the specific collection, establishing its relevance, and convincing a court to order disclosure in the face of government opposition, citing the same legal provision. None of these paths is easy. All of them are possible. The 2018 Freedom of Information response that acknowledged the existence of the restricted collection also, inadvertently, provided a map for the most promising path forward. By citing the specific provision of the Access to Information Act under which the materials are restricted, the response identified the legal framework that would need to be engaged to challenge the restriction. By identifying the materials as relevant to outstanding Indigenous rights claims, it defined the category of legal proceeding in which the material's relevance could be most directly argued. It also, perhaps unintentionally, provided a measure of implicit confirmation that the materials contained content relevant to those claims. The government wouldn't cite a provision specifically designed to protect materials relevant to Indigenous rights claims if the materials were actually a collection of mundane administrative correspondence from 1971. The choice of restriction provision is itself a form of disclosure. Lawyers working on Indigenous land claims who read the 2018 response carefully will have noted this implication. Whether they have acted on it, and what the results of any such action might have been, is not publicly known. There is a generation of researchers now working on questions at the intersection of Canadian colonial history, Indigenous rights, and pre-contact archaeology who are approaching these questions with tools and frameworks that weren't available to earlier researchers. They have access to ancient DNA analysis, which is transforming the picture of pre-contact population movements. They have LiDAR and other remote sensing technologies that can reveal landscape features without physical access. They have digital humanities tools that allow systematic comparison of documentary records across institutions and time periods. They have Indigenous studies methodologies that provide frameworks for engaging respectfully with oral traditions as historical evidence. And they are operating in an institutional and political environment that, while still resistant to many of the implications of this research, has shifted substantially from the environment of 1971. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work has changed what can be said publicly in Canada about the relationship between colonial administration and Indigenous historical knowledge. The ongoing resolution of land claims has created legal contexts in which pre-contact historical evidence is directly relevant and practically consequential. The growing movement for UNDRIP implementation, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, has created international frameworks that define the management of Indigenous historical knowledge as a human rights issue. In this environment, the suppression of pre-contact historical evidence is harder to sustain as a routine administrative matter. It has become, increasingly, a human rights question. And human rights questions attract a different kind of scrutiny than archival administration questions. The story of Canada's 1971 archival removal is ultimately a story about the relationship between knowledge and power, about who controls the record of the past and what that control makes possible in the present. This is not a uniquely Canadian story, but it is a specifically Canadian story, grounded in the specific landscape of the Canadian North, in the specific history of the colonial administration of that landscape, in the specific legal and political contests that were beginning to develop in 1971 and that continue to develop today. The 6,000 documents that were removed in November of 1971 are not merely historical curiosities, they are evidence. Evidence of a pre-contact history that is still contested, still legally consequential, still alive in the oral traditions and landscape relationships of the northern communities whose history it is. The removal served specific interests at a specific moment. Those interests haven't disappeared. They are still present in the legal and political landscape. They are still served by the continued restriction of the materials. But the landscape is shifting. The political environment has changed. The legal tools available to challenge archival restrictions have developed. The communities whose history was suppressed have maintained their knowledge and are asserting their rights with increasing legal sophistication. The silence of 50 years is not the silence of resolution. It's the silence of an unresolved question, a question that will not go away because the knowledge that the documents contained didn't go away. There is something you should know about the specific month of November, 1971. November is when the Canadian parliamentary session was in its active phase. It's when the federal government's administrative machinery was running at full speed. It's when decisions made in the preceding months were being implemented across departments. It is also, in the northern landscape, the month when winter closes in, when ice forms on the lakes and rivers that define the geography of the removed documents' coverage. When the landscape becomes, for several months, inaccessible to anything but the most determined expedition, November is when you close things down for the winter, when you put things away. The removal operation completed in November of 1971 was putting something away. Closing down access to something before the coming legal and political winter, before the challenges that were building would arrive in full force. The winter that the people who ordered that removal feared was the winter of Indigenous rights litigation, of court cases that would use historical evidence to challenge the legal frameworks that defined the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state. That winter arrived anyway. It arrived in the form of Calder, of Guerin, of Sparrow, of Delgamuukw, of Haida Nation, of Tsilhqot'in, of case after case that has progressively, unevenly, and incompletely expanded the recognition of Indigenous rights in Canadian law. The removed documents didn't prevent that winter. They just shaped the terrain on which it was fought. We are more than 50 years past November 1971. The children who were born in that month are now in their 50s. The grandchildren of the Indigenous elders whose knowledge went into the Northern correspondence files are the adults of today, carrying that knowledge forward, asserting their community's rights in legal and political forums that have changed substantially since 1971. The landscape that the Geographic Series files described has been partly flooded, partly developed, partly left in forms that still carry the traces of whatever was there. The rivers still flow. The rock is still ancient. The places that multiple generations of observers found significant are still in the landscape, whatever their current condition. The documents are still somewhere, restricted, maintained under a legal provision that was specifically enacted to protect them, relevant to claims that have not been resolved. And the question of what they contain remains, after 50 years, unanswered in any official form. This is not a comfortable place to end a story. It doesn't have the resolution that narrative logic suggests should come. The mystery hasn't been solved. The suppressed history hasn't been revealed. The silence hasn't broken. But that discomfort is itself part of the story. The absence of resolution is not a failure of investigation. It is the current state of an ongoing situation. The situation that began in November of 1971, or that reached a particular peak in November of 1971, continues. The documents are still out there. The silence is still there. And the question is still there, louder now in some ways than it was 50 years ago. What was in those 6,000 documents that Canada's National Archives removed in 1971? Nobody will say. But more people are asking. And the asking matters. Let's end where this story really begins, in the land itself. The Canadian North is one of the oldest landscapes on Earth. The Rock of the Shield has been here for billions of years. The rivers have been flowing in their current courses for thousands of years. The lakes have been filling with sediment for as long as the ice has been retreating. In all of that time, before the colonial period, before the fur trade, before the missionaries and the surveyors and the government agents and the archivists who removed 6,000 documents in November of 1971, this land was inhabited by people. Generations upon generations of people living in relationship with the rock and the water and the trees and the animals, developing knowledge of the land that accumulated over centuries and millennia. That knowledge is still here. Not in the Federal Archive, not in the restricted collection where the removed documents may reside, but in the communities that maintained it across all the generations of colonial effort to suppress it. The land is still here. The people are still here. The knowledge is still here. 6,000 documents were removed to prevent that knowledge from entering the official record at a moment when the official record mattered for legal and political purposes. They are still removed, but the knowledge they reflected remains. And the land that it describes continues to speak, in ways that no archival operation has ever been able to fully silence. Whatever was in those documents, the most important thing to understand about this story is not the mystery of their contents, it is the certainty that the knowledge they contained did not disappear when they were removed. It persists, in the land, in the communities, in the oral traditions that no federal operation has ever succeeded in reaching. The silence of 50 years is the silence of an archive. The land has been speaking all along. There is something that hasn't been said yet, something that researchers who have spent significant time with this story eventually arrive at, and then spend considerable time trying to figure out how to say, without losing the careful evidentiary grounding they've built. The thing that hasn't been said is this: the 1971 removal may not have been the first. The internal memo from 1971 uses language that implies the people involved in the operation were familiar with this kind of activity. Phrases like transfer complete and the originals will not be required for public access purposes read as procedural formulations, the kind of language that arises when an institution has established practices for a type of activity, not the uncertain, improvised language of people doing something unprecedented, but the efficient shorthand of people working within a known framework. If the 1971 operation followed established procedures, those procedures had to have been established at some prior point. There had to have been earlier removals, earlier iterations of the same kind of operation that created the institutional template. When Margaret Forsyth conducted her inferential archival work in the 1980s and 1990s, she noted several instances of what she described as prior gap events, periods in the archival record before 1971, where the same kind of inferential analysis she was applying to the 1971 removal suggested that materials had gone missing. She was careful not to claim that these represented earlier deliberate removals. She framed them as potentially significant absences whose causes could not be determined from the available evidence. But the pattern she identified suggests that the 1971 removal may have been the most dramatic episode in a longer series of similar operations. Operations that date back, potentially, to much earlier periods in the history of the National Archives and its predecessor institutions. The founding period of the Public Archives of Canada in the 1870s coincides with some of the most intensive early federal activity in the Northern Territories. The numbered treaties were being negotiated. The Northwest Mounted Police were establishing their presence in the Western Territories. The Geological Survey of Canada was conducting its earliest systematic surveys of the North. All of this activity generated documentary records. And from the very beginning, the management of those records reflected an awareness that some of what was being found and reported didn't sit easily with the official narrative of a land waiting to be settled. The Indian agents and treaty commissioners who worked in northern and western communities in the 1870s and 1880s wrote reports. Those reports went to Ottawa. Some of them described what they found in the landscape, what they were told by Indigenous community members, what they understood about the history of the places where they were working. Some of those reports are in the accessible public record. Some appear, on the basis of Forsyth's inferential analysis, to be absent when they should be present. The gaps in the archival record don't begin in 1971. They begin much earlier. This longer history of archival management makes the 1971 removal more comprehensible, not less. It wasn't a sudden departure from established practice. It was an intensification, a dramatic and unusually comprehensive episode in a pattern that had been operating in quieter ways since the beginning of the federal archival system itself. There is a specific figure in the early history of the Public Archives of Canada whose role deserves more scrutiny than it has received in this context. Douglas Brimner was the first Dominion archivist, appointed in 1872 and serving until 1902. He was the person who established the foundational organizational principles and collecting practices of the institution. He shaped, in ways that lasted long after his tenure, what the archives would contain and how it would be organized. Brimner was a careful, methodical man who took his responsibility for the documentary heritage of the new country seriously. He also operated in a political and cultural environment that had specific expectations about what Canadian history was and what it should contain. The intellectual framework of his era was explicit about the civilizational hierarchy that placed Indigenous peoples below settlers in the developmental scale of humanity. This wasn't personal prejudice on Brimner's part. It was the foundational assumption of the society he served. Within that framework, certain categories of historical material were valuable, and certain categories were not. Materials related to the civilized history of Canada, the European colonial enterprise, the development of governmental institutions, the achievements of explorers and administrators. These were the priority. Materials related to Indigenous history, especially pre-contact Indigenous history, occupied an uncertain position. They were sometimes collected, sometimes documented, sometimes preserved. But they were preserved within a framework that defined their significance differently from the materials of the colonial project. That framework shaped the early organization of the archives in ways that made certain kinds of materials more accessible and certain kinds less accessible. Not through explicit suppression, but through the quieter mechanism of institutional priority, of what got catalogued carefully and what got filed away in ways that made it harder to find. The organizational decisions of the 1870s and 1880s created the file structure that the 1971 removal operated within. The geographic series, the correspondence files, the pre-contact materials category, these organizational categories had histories that stretched back decades. Understanding those histories would require a level of archival historiography that has not been applied to the specific questions raised by the 1971 removal. Let's talk about what might be called the archaeology of silence in the Canadian archival system, the practice of reading absences as evidence. Historians who work with incomplete archival records develop over time a sixth sense for the shape of what's missing. They notice when the documentation is denser than expected in some periods and thinner than expected in others. They notice when references in available documents to other documents, enclosures, attachments, related files, don't lead to materials that can actually be located. They notice patterns of absence. In the specific archival landscape relevant to the 1971 removal, the archaeology of silence reveals several striking features. The Northern Correspondence files, as a category, show significantly higher documentation density in the period before roughly 1960 than after. This could reflect reduced federal activity in the North, but the period after 1960 was actually one of increased federal presence in northern communities, as the government expanded residential schools, health services, and administrative infrastructure across the North. More activity should generate more documentation, not less. The decreased density suggests that post-1960 Northern correspondence is missing from accessible collections in greater proportion than pre-1960 material. The geographic series files, as a category, show particular thinning in the coverage of regions that were subsequently affected by hydroelectric development. This pattern, if systematic, would suggest that the pre-development survey materials for those regions were removed before the development occurred, not after, which would imply that the 1971 removal, comprehensive as it apparently was, may have been preceded by earlier, more targeted operations that removed specific materials from specific geographic series in advance of specific development projects. The pre-contact materials category shows perhaps the most dramatic archaeology of silence. What exists in accessible form is fragmentary in ways that don't reflect random loss through normal archival attrition. The fragments that remain tend to be materials that are vague in their geographic specificity or general in their archaeological implications. The materials that would be most specifically valuable for corroborating particular anomalous findings or particular Indigenous historical claims are precisely the materials that are absent. This selective absence is not consistent with random loss. It is consistent with targeted removal. The connection between this story and the history of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples deserves mention. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which operated from 1991 to 1996 and produced a landmark multi-volume report, was the most comprehensive official examination of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state conducted up to that point. Its researchers gathered extensive documentation, conducted thousands of interviews, and examined archival records across the country. Several researchers associated with the Commission's work encountered the question of missing archival materials. In at least one documented instance, a Commission researcher pursuing documentation of Indigenous land use in a northern region found the same pattern of archival gaps that Forsyth had documented in her earlier work. The researcher filed a report with the Commission's staff, noting the apparent systematic absence of materials that should have been present based on other references in the accessible record. The Commission's final report, in its sections dealing with historical documentation and archives, includes several careful references to the limitations of the accessible archival record and the need for further archival research. It does not specifically address the 1,971 removal, but the language of those sections is consistent with knowledge of the issue and with a deliberate choice to frame it in terms that pointed toward further research without making specific claims that couldn't be fully supported by the accessible evidence. The Commission's recommendation for further archival research into the pre-contact period has not been systematically implemented. The political will and the institutional coordination required for such an undertaking have not been assembled in the decades since the Commission's report. The story of what happened in the Canadian North in the decades surrounding 1971 is also a story about the relationship between two apparently separate processes, resource extraction and historical suppression. The hydroelectric projects and mining developments that transformed the northern landscape were not simply economic projects. They were also geopolitical projects, expressions of the Canadian state's assertion of sovereignty over a vast territory and its resources. The legal basis for that sovereignty depended on the colonial framework that defined Indigenous land rights in limited and conditional terms. Pre-contact historical evidence that complicated the picture of Indigenous land use and occupation in specific northern regions was therefore not merely historically inconvenient, it was legally inconvenient. Evidence of complex, organized, long-term human activity in specific northern locations could, in the right legal context, support Indigenous claims to those locations that would complicate or prevent development. The removal of documentary evidence describing those locations, combined with the physical development that destroyed the physical evidence in those locations, created a space in which the legal framework could operate without the complications that the full evidence might have introduced. This is not to say that the hydroelectric projects were planned with the specific purpose of covering up pre-contact evidence. The primary motivation for those projects was economic and political. But the management of what the pre-construction surveys found and the archival operation that removed the documentary record of that evidence suggests that someone understood the connection and acted accordingly. The intersection of resource extraction, colonial sovereignty assertion, and archival suppression is not a coincidence in Canada's northern history. It is a recurring pattern that operates whenever economically and politically significant decisions about Northern Territory intersect with historically and legally significant questions about Indigenous land rights. In the Anishinaabe oral tradition, there is a concept sometimes translated as the land remembers. It refers to the understanding that the landscape retains knowledge of everything that has happened on it, that the land is not a passive backdrop for human history, but an active participant in it, with its own form of memory and its own capacity to communicate. This concept is not unique to the Anishinaabe. Versions of it appear in the oral traditions of Indigenous peoples across the Canadian North and across North America more broadly. It reflects a way of understanding the relationship between human beings and the landscape they inhabit that is fundamentally different from the extractive and ownership-based relationship that colonial frameworks assume. The land remembers. This is not merely a poetic expression. It is a claim about the nature of historical knowledge and where it resides. It asserts that the historical record is not limited to human documentation, that the landscape itself carries information about what has happened on it, in forms that are accessible to those who know how to read them. Geologists understand a version of this. The rock record preserves the history of the Earth's geological past in forms that can be read by those trained to read them. The sediment layers at the bottom of lakes preserve records of environmental change that extend back thousands of years. The chemistry of ancient soils can reveal patterns of land use that left no visible surface traces. Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge is a more comprehensive version of the same principle, encompassing biological, geological, hydrological, and cultural information about specific landscapes accumulated over thousands of years of intimate relationship with those landscapes. The removed documents contained federal officials' transcriptions of portions of that knowledge. The transcriptions were partial, imperfect, filtered through the cultural and linguistic frameworks of the colonial observers who recorded them, but they were transcriptions of something real, of knowledge that was there and that remains there in the communities and the land that generated it. The history that the 1971 removal tried to manage is the history of a continent. It is the history of 15,000 or more years of human presence on a landscape. It is a history that includes migration, development, complexity, decline, transformation, and continuity. It is a history that the official colonial narrative has never fully engaged with, partly because doing so would complicate the legal and political frameworks that colonial governance depends on, and partly because the evidence for it has been systematically managed in ways that make it harder to see. The 1971 removal is one chapter in that management. A dramatic chapter because of its scale and its documentation, but one chapter in a much longer story. The longer story is one that Canada will eventually have to tell honestly. The pressures toward that honesty are real, accumulating, and not going away. The ongoing land claims process, the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, the growing influence of Indigenous perspectives in Canadian academic and cultural life, the slow shift in the political and legal environment toward genuine recognition of Indigenous rights, all of these are moving the country toward a reckoning with the history that its official narratives have excluded. The 1971 removal will be part of that reckoning. When the restricted collection is eventually identified and accessed, in whatever circumstances make that possible, what is found there will be part of the evidence that shapes the understanding of what Canada has known about its pre-contact past and what it chose to do with that knowledge. This is where the story currently stands. 6,000 documents, November 1971. A government building in Ottawa, a truck backing up to a service entrance. Archivists following instructions they didn't feel comfortable questioning. A memo filed and eventually found by a researcher looking for something else entirely. A collection of materials, somewhere in a restricted federal repository or somewhere else entirely, that has not been publicly accessible for more than 50 years. A legal framework enacted in 2006 that maintains the restriction under a provision specifically designed to protect materials relevant to outstanding Indigenous rights claims. A series of Freedom of Information responses that acknowledge the operation without explaining it, that cite legal provisions without describing their application, that manage the inquiry without resolving it. Researchers who have spent careers trying to understand what was taken and why. Indigenous communities whose knowledge provides the human context for the official documentary silence. A landscape that was changed, in some cases permanently, in ways that destroyed the physical evidence of what the documents described. And the question that has been at the center of all of it, 50 years old now, and still unanswered in any official form. What was in those 6,000 documents that Canada's National Archives removed in November of 1971? Nobody will say. The silence holds. But the land remembers. And the people who know the land are still here, carrying in their traditions and their knowledge of specific places and specific histories, the memory of what was there and what was taken and what remains. The silence of the archive is not the silence of the truth. The truth has been speaking in other registers all along. There are threads in this story that connect outward to dimensions of Canadian and North American pre-contact history that rarely appear in the same conversation as archival suppression, but that are essential to understanding the full significance of what may have been in those 6,000 documents. One of the most significant involves the copper trade. Pure copper, in a form that requires no smelting, exists in large natural deposits in the Lake Superior region. It exists in deposits along the shore of the lake and on Michipicoten Island, and in several other locations in northern Ontario and northern Michigan. This copper has been worked by Indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The archaeological record of copper tool use in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence region extends back at least 8,000 years, and the scale of copper extraction and use in the pre-contact period was substantial. What's less commonly discussed is that this copper moved. Archaeologically documented copper artifacts from the Lake Superior source appear in sites across eastern North America, in burial mounds in Ohio and Indiana, in sites in New York and New England, in locations along the Atlantic coast. The copper trade network was one of the most extensive material exchange systems in pre-contact North America. Some researchers have argued, controversially, that the Lake Superior copper trade extended even further, that copper from this source eventually made its way across the Atlantic through exchange networks that are poorly understood but archaeologically attested. The evidence for this is disputed, but it is not absent. Copper artifacts of a type consistent with Lake Superior origin have been identified in European contexts, and the debate about how to interpret those identifications has not been resolved. This matters for the 1971 removal, because the geographic coverage of the removed documents' geographic series files includes regions along the northern edges of the Great Lakes copper trade network. If those files contained documentation of unusual artifacts or unusual landscape features in those regions, features associated with the copper trade or its broader context, their removal would have served the purpose of keeping that evidence out of any discussion of pre-contact connectivity between North America and other parts of the world. There is an equally significant thread involving the river systems of northern Quebec and their role in pre-contact movement through the continent. The river systems of northern Quebec form one of the most extraordinary natural transportation networks on Earth. The major rivers, the Eastmain, the Grande Rivière de la Baleine, the Rupert, the Broadback, all drain southward into James Bay, and they connect through portages and tributary systems to the St. Lawrence and to the vast interior of the continent. Together, they form a network through which people and goods could move efficiently across thousands of kilometers. These river systems were not merely convenient routes for movement, they were the economic arteries of the pre-contact North. The communities along them were not isolated. They were nodes in networks of exchange and movement that connected them to communities across a much wider territory. The pre-construction surveys for the La Grande hydroelectric complex, conducted in the 1960s and early 1970s, necessarily covered the major rivers and lake systems that would be affected by the projects. Those surveys found evidence of extensive long-term human use of those river systems, evidence that was eventually submerged beneath the reservoirs. The Northern Correspondence files would have contained decades of documentation of federal contacts with the communities along those river systems. Documentation of those communities' knowledge of the river systems, their use of specific locations, their oral traditions about those places, and their accounts of what had been there before them. The geographic series files for Northern Quebec would have contained the accumulated documentary record of everything the federal government had gathered about those river systems over nearly a century of administration. Both categories of material, the Northern Correspondence and the geographic series for Northern Quebec, appear in the partial inventory of the 1971 removal. The oral traditions of the Cree communities that lived along those rivers before the hydroelectric projects describe those river systems with extraordinary specificity. They name individual features. They describe the history of specific portages and camping grounds. They identify locations where unusual things were found or where significant events occurred. Some of those accounts have been documented by academic researchers. Some have been maintained exclusively within the communities. And some, in the period before the hydroelectric projects, were told to federal officials who recorded them in the Northern Correspondence files. The Cree people of Northern Quebec were directly affected by the hydroelectric projects in ways that permanently altered their relationship with the landscape. The removed documents described. The flooding of James Bay project reservoirs displaced communities from their traditional territories. The subsistence practices that had sustained those communities for generations were disrupted. The specific landscape knowledge associated with particular locations was severed from its geographic context when those locations disappeared underwater. The Grand Council of the Crees has been litigating and negotiating the consequences of the hydroelectric projects for decades. Their legal and political work has depended, to a significant degree, on the ability to document historical land use and occupancy in the affected territories. The removal of documentary materials that could have corroborated that documentation was not, from their perspective, a neutral archival event. It was an action with direct consequences for their ability to assert and defend their rights. The dimension of this story that involves human remains is perhaps the most sensitive, but it is also among the most directly relevant to the question of what the removed documents might have contained. Pre-contact burials and human remains have been found throughout the Canadian North, in contexts that range from well understood within the academic archaeological framework to deeply anomalous. The well-understood cases have been appropriately researched, documented, and in many cases repatriated to descendant communities under repatriation frameworks that have developed over the past few decades. The anomalous cases are a different matter. There are documented instances of human remains being found in Canadian northern contexts that presented physical characteristics not consistent with known Indigenous populations of the region, or that were found in archaeological contexts that didn't match expectations based on established understanding of pre-contact population history. These cases appear in the partial documentary record that survives the 1,971 removal in the form of references in accessible materials to other materials that no longer appear to be accessible. The treatment of anomalous human remains in the pre-contact archaeological record is one of the most politically charged areas in North American archaeology. The academic establishment has developed strong institutional responses to claims of anomalous human remains, responses that prioritize the protection of the standard narrative over the investigation of potentially inconvenient findings. The Kennewick Man controversy in the United States, which involved a skeleton found in Washington state in 1996 with physical characteristics that complicated straightforward Indigenous descent claims, illustrated the intensity of the institutional and political dynamics involved. The controversy lasted years and involved competing legal claims, scientific debates, and complex questions about who has the right to make determinations about ancient human remains. In Canada, similar controversies have been managed with somewhat less public attention, but with the same fundamental dynamics. The federal government, through its management of both archaeological practice and archival access, has been positioned as the arbiter of these questions in ways that serve the interests of narrative coherence over evidentiary completeness. If the removed documents contain documentation of anomalous human remains from northern Canadian contexts, their removal would have served the purpose of preventing those cases from entering the public record in ways that might have complicated the standard narrative of pre-contact North American population history. Let's talk about what other countries have done with comparable situations, because Canada is not the only nation to have managed its pre-contact historical record through archival mechanisms, and some comparative perspective illuminates what is and isn't inevitable about the situation Canada finds itself in. Australia's experience with the management of Aboriginal historical evidence provides perhaps the most direct comparison. The terra nullius doctrine that was the legal foundation of Australian colonial sovereignty depended, as Canada's equivalent framework depended, on the maintenance of a particular picture of pre-contact Indigenous presence and land use. The management of historical evidence about that presence was a consistent feature of Australian colonial administration. Australia has moved, over the past several decades, toward a more systematic engagement with the question of suppressed historical evidence. The Mabo decision in 1992, which overturned the terra nullius doctrine, changed the legal landscape in ways that created both the need and the political space for greater historical honesty. Subsequent work in archives and courts and academic institutions has progressively filled in parts of the picture that had been managed out of the official record. This has not been a smooth or complete process. The management of historical evidence in Australia continues in various forms, and the full accounting for what was suppressed and why has not been achieved. But the comparison suggests that legal and political change of the kind that the Mabo decision represented can create conditions in which archival suppression becomes harder to sustain. Canada's legal evolution in Indigenous rights has followed a somewhat different trajectory but the direction is similar. The progressive recognition of Indigenous title and rights through the Supreme Court decisions of the past several decades has created conditions in which the management of historical evidence becomes increasingly difficult to maintain, without explicit acknowledgement of what is being managed. Why? There is a specific moment in the documented legal history of Canadian Indigenous rights that connects directly to the question of the removed documents. In the Delgamuukw case, which reached the Supreme Court of Canada in 1997, the court made a landmark ruling on the nature of Aboriginal title and on the evidentiary standards for establishing it. The ruling was important for many reasons, but one aspect is particularly relevant here. The court ruled that oral traditions of Indigenous communities must be treated as a legitimate form of evidence of historical land use and occupancy. This ruling had been anticipated in some form. Legal scholars working on Indigenous rights had been arguing for this position for years, but its formal establishment by the Supreme Court changed the evidentiary landscape for all future land claims litigation. The practical significance of the ruling for the 1971 removal is this. If oral traditions are legitimate evidence, then the federal government's argument that Indigenous historical claims can only be supported by documentary evidence becomes less persuasive. The oral traditions that exist in northern Indigenous communities, describing specific landscape features, specific pre-contact history, specific uses of specific locations, are now legally recognizable as evidence on their own terms. The removed documents were relevant to those claims partly because they would have provided federal official confirmation of Indigenous oral testimony. But if the oral testimony is itself credible legal evidence, the removal of the official confirmation, while still significant, is less catastrophic for the legal claims than it would have been in the pre-Delgamuukw era. The 1971 removal was timed for a pre-Delgamuukw world, one in which Indigenous oral traditions needed documentary corroboration to be legally effective. The world has changed enough since then that the removed documents, important as they remain, are no longer the only available pathway to establishing the historical claims they relate to. This evolution in the legal framework is part of why the question of what was in the removed documents remains active rather than merely historical. In the post-Delgamuukw environment, the documents are relevant not just to establishing claims that might otherwise be impossible to establish, but to corroborating and strengthening claims that can now be pursued through oral historical evidence, and to demonstrating that the federal government's own officials documented information about those claims while they were being suppressed in the archival system. The latter use is arguably the most damaging to the federal position. If the removed documents can be shown to contain federal officials' documentation of Indigenous oral traditions about specific landscape features and specific land use patterns, that documentation becomes evidence not just of the historical claims themselves, but of the government's long-standing knowledge of those claims and its active management of the evidence for them. This is a qualitatively different kind of legal problem from simply not having enough evidence to establish a claim. It is a problem of documented knowledge and deliberate suppression. The difference is the difference between losing a case for insufficient evidence and losing a case for obstruction. The legal team advising the federal government on Indigenous rights matters will have been aware of this dimension of the 1971 removal from the beginning. Managing access to the removed materials is not just about protecting historical narrative. It is about protecting the government from the legal consequences of demonstrated suppression of evidence in ongoing litigation. The researchers and communities who are actively working on this question today are doing so with awareness of this legal dimension. Their work is not purely academic. It is part of a broader effort to establish the full scope of what the federal government knew when it knew it and what it chose to do with that knowledge. That effort will continue. The tools are better than they've ever been. The legal framework is more supportive than it's ever been. The political environment, while still resistant in many ways, is more open to these questions than it was in 1971. The silence of 50 years is real, but it is not impenetrable. It has been penetrated before. When the right person found the right document at the right moment, it will be penetrated again. And when it is, what is found will matter, not just academically, not just historically, but in the courts and in the communities and in the political conversations that are shaping what Canada becomes in the decades ahead. 6,000 documents, November 1971. Nobody will say what was in them, but someone knows, and someday the knowing will become saying. The final thing to understand about this story is that it is not finished. Every story about suppressed history eventually reaches the moment of reckoning, the moment when what was hidden becomes known, when the management fails, when the silence breaks. Those moments don't arrive on schedule, they don't announce themselves in advance. They arrive through the accumulation of pressure, the patient work of researchers and communities and lawyers, the unexpected discovery in an unrelated archival search, the political shift that changes what can be said and what must be answered. The reckoning for the 1971 removal has not arrived yet. The documents are still restricted, the official explanation is still absent, the silence still holds. But the pressure has not stopped building since 1971. It has been building for more than 50 years, with every land claims proceeding that encounters the gap where corroborating evidence should be, with every researcher who traces a thread back to a missing file, with every community member who knows what the oral traditions say about the landscape that the documents described, with every year that passes and the silence doesn't break. The history of Canada is not a finished story. The pre-contact history of this continent is not a settled question. The relationship between Indigenous peoples and the state that was established on their territories is not a resolved matter. 6,000 documents removed in November of 1971 are part of that unfinished story. Their contents, whatever they are, belong to the full account of what happened on this land and what that means for the people whose relationship with this land extends back thousands of years. The silence will not hold forever. History never does. One more thing before this story rests. There is a road in northern Ontario. It cuts through boreal forest for hundreds of kilometres, connecting communities that before its construction had been accessible only by water or air. It was built in the 1960s as part of the broader infrastructure development that was transforming the north during that period. Along the route of that road, during the construction surveys that preceded it, workers found several things that the official construction reports don't mention. A retired highway construction engineer named William Dorset described some of them in letters he wrote late in his life to a small newsletter published by a Northern Ontario Historical Society. He described carved stones that appeared to have been worked deliberately and that bore markings unlike anything in the regional Indigenous tradition he was familiar with. He described low walls of fitted stone in a sheltered valley that the road would eventually bypass. He described finding, beneath soil, that the construction analysis had suggested was undisturbed, evidence of previous human activity at a depth that didn't match the expected chronology of human settlement in the region. He filed his observations. He was told that federal heritage officials would handle the assessment. He watched the road get built on schedule. He never heard about any assessment. He wrote his letters in the early 2000s because he was in his 80s, and he thought the information should exist somewhere other than his own memory. The newsletter published them in 2003 and 2004. They were read by the small community of people who subscribed to small Northern Ontario Historical Society newsletters. Several of the locations he described are in regions covered by the geographic series files of the 1971 removal. William Dorset died in 2007. The road is still there. The valley is still there. The things he found are presumably still there, under the forest floor, under whatever the decades of frost and thaw have done to them. The land keeps its secrets better than archives do, but not forever. The stories we tell about the past shape the choices we make about the future. Canada's story about its own pre-contact past has been managed, for more than a century, in ways that served the interests of colonial governance over the interests of historical truth. The 1971 removal was a dramatic episode in that management. Its consequences continue to shape what is legally arguable, what is academically discussable, and what is publicly acknowledged about the history of this land and the peoples who have inhabited it. Getting the history right matters, not as an academic exercise, not as a matter of national guilt, but because the people whose history was suppressed are here, asserting rights that depend on that history, and deserve the full evidentiary support of a record that has not been managed against them. 6,000 documents, 50 years of silence, the asking continues. And maybe that's the most honest thing to say about all of this. The asking continues. The people who found things in the northern landscape and reported them, only to have the reports disappear. The archivists who moved boxes they weren't told the contents of. The researchers who spent decades reconstructing the shape of what was taken. The community members who held on to knowledge that the official world declined to recognize. The lawyers who argued cases that would have been stronger with the missing evidence. The elders who told their grandchildren about places that are now underwater. All of them were asking, in their different ways, for the full story to be told, for the landscape to be read without the filters that colonial administration imposed. For the history of this land to belong to everyone who inhabits it, including the people who have been inhabiting it for 15,000 years. That asking is the through line of this entire story. Longer than 50 years, longer than the archives themselves. As long as the rivers that flow through the Shield Rock, as old as the traditions that named them. The silence that started in November of 1971 inches, a government building in Ottawa, will not be the last word. It never is. Canada holds its breath around this question, has held it for half a century. The cold archive in Ottawa, the flooded valleys of Quebec and Labrador, the Shield Rock beneath the boreal forest, they all hold something back. Something that official history hasn't finished deciding how to tell. But the people of the North know. They have always known. And their knowing doesn't wait for archival access or freedom of information timelines or legal proceedings, or the political will of governments that benefit from the silence. The 6,000 documents taken in November of 1971 from Canada's National Archives are part of the story. A significant part. But they are not the whole story. The whole story was never in any archive. It is in the land, and in the people who know the land, and in the relationship between them, that no removal operation has ever succeeded in ending. That relationship is ongoing. The story is ongoing. The questions remain open, and the silence, though it holds in the way that northern ice holds in early spring, under pressure, full of cracks, listening for the right conditions to finally give way.